in addition to that global targets, which has already mentioned by Andrei Mushniaga, was in addition to this global target, the General Assembly again requested the WHO to continue to develop a multi-sectoral accountability framework on TB to evaluate the implementation of the global targets. So in the next slide, here you can see the NTB strategy top 10 indicators at the global and the national level. I'm not going to read all those 10 indicators, but I would like to draw your attention to indicator number 5 and number 6, which is about the TB infection treatment coverage. So by 2025, as you see, TB treatment coverage should be equal to 90 or more 90%, and 90% and more contact investigation coverage. So the next slide shows the the 4 new targets which has been set in the UN high-level meeting on tuberculosis, and Andrei Mushniaga already stopped and explained about these 4 targets, new targets, so I'm not going to mention about that. So I want to introduce you to the multi-sectoral accountability framework for TB. So, yes, as I have mentioned earlier, the development of a multi-sectoral accountability framework on TB by WHO, of course in partnership with other partners, was requested by the Moscow Declaration, by the World Health Assembly, and the UN Global General Assembly high-level meeting on tuberculosis. So what is MAF? In short, we call it MAF TB. What is MAF? What is the rationale behind this MAF? So a multi-sectoral accountability framework on TB is a tool to achieve and to measure progress towards implementing TB high-level political commitments and targets at 3 levels. It's national, regional, global, regional, and national levels. So implementation of this tool will strengthen multi-sectoral coordination, cooperation, and accountability for TB response, and faster progress toward high-level global targets to end TB. So the framework consists of 4 main elements, and you can see here in the slide. It's a commitment, it's action, monitoring and reporting, and the review. So the framework itself provides an overview and structure of these 4 main components and the relations between them. The framework should be adapted and implemented at country level with the constitutional, legal, regulatory frameworks, with the consideration of the local and the national legal regulatory frameworks. So these frameworks need to define who is accountable when we are talking about the commitments. For example, different ministries and agencies involved in TB response, individual organizations, including civil society and affected communities. What commitments and actions they are accountable for, and how those actions will be held. It's about the actions. How to track the progress and how to monitor and report the progress. It's about monitoring and reporting. And the last and very important is review. How to review those progress, to assess the results from monitoring and reporting, and to develop recommendations for new or for better and improved actions. So I'm not going to stop in all these 4 components, but I would like to mention that all...
Отметить, что все предлагаемые действия в системе основаны на глобальных обязательствах и целевых ориентирах, о которых мы уже с вами говорили. Важность многосекторальной координации и подотчетности в ответ на ситуацию с туберкулезом определены в ряде стратегических документах, таких как план действий по борьбе с туберкулезом для Европейского региона ВОЗ, об этом говорил Оскар в своей вступительной речи, в документе с изложением общей политики для межсекторального сотрудничества. Это такой вот договорной документ, который был подписан организациями ООН и партнерами, а также другие очень важные документы, которые представлены здесь на этом слайде. Они касаются борьбы с туберкулезом, ВИЧ-вирусными гепатитами. Это такие рамочные документы, которые были разработаны в поддержку реализации консенсусного документа. Я бы хотела также упомянуть, что одна из недавних рекомендаций технической консультативной группы по туберкулезу стоит в том, чтобы оказывать поддержку статусным членам в завершении работы по проведению исходной самостоятельной оценки многосторонней системы подотчетности и предоставить рекомендации по адаптации и внедрению системы мониторинга и оценки на страновом уровне. Эта рекомендация была принята на последнем заседании тематической консультативной группы. Процесс адаптации и реализации многосторонней системы должен происходить после той оценки, которая будет проведена на национальном уровне, для того, чтобы провести обзор ситуации, для того, чтобы понять прогресс в реализации национальных планов и что нужно сделать для укрепления подотчетности и координации многосекторальных действий. В помощь странам, наряду с многосекторальной системой подотчетности, ВОЗ разработала перечень контрольных оценок, вопросов для исходной оценки, предназначенные для стран. И сейчас я бы хотела показать вам, какие элементы включены в этот перечень контрольных вопросов. Они связаны с профилактикой туберкулезной инфекции. И вот здесь, в этой таблице, вы видите, что во время исходной оценки оценивается реализация рекомендаций совещаний высокого уровня на национальном уровне стран. Как вы видите, страны должны определить, насколько успешно эти меры политики реализуются на национальном уровне. Если еще их реализация не началась, что нужно сделать для этого? Кроме того, дается ссылка на исходный документ для определения того, кто за что отвечает. Далее, что касается профилактического лечения туберкулеза, здесь дается возможность оценить, как эта работа проводится на уровне стран. Дается ссылка на ВОЗовские документы, которые должны быть приняты на национальном уровне. Кроме того, сюда входит возможность оценки, реализации рекомендаций ВОЗ на уровне стран. Здесь вы видите раздел по принятию и осуществлению руководства ВОЗ по туберкулезу. Как я уже говорил,
и разработки плана по межсекторальному сотрудничеству, а также будет осуществляться, оказывать помощь в создании механизма обзора и руководящего органа, а также согласование данного механизма обеспечения подотчетности с существующими планами. Я очень кратко хочу обратить ваше внимание на то, что мы проводим оценку прогресса по достижению целевых показателей. В этом году ВОЗ подготовил первый доклад по достижению целевых показателей, заложенных в политической декларации высокого уровня. И, конечно, проводится обзор влияния пандемии COVID-19, вырабатываются рекомендации. И помимо других целевых показателей, данный доклад отслеживает прогресс в области профилактического лечения. Как видите, мы должны были охватить 30 миллионов человек профилактическим лечением туберкулеза в 2018-2019 годах. Но оценка прогресса показала, что только 6,7 миллиона человек получили профилактическое лечение за указанный период времени. Данный доклад показывает и проводит соотношение данной работы с работой по диагностике туберкулеза с другими областями борьбы с туберкулезом. И, наконец, были выработаны 10 рекомендаций странам. Рекомендация номер 5 посвящена существенному наращиванию масштаба профилактического лечения туберкулеза. Итак, какие действия должны быть предприняты для того, чтобы осуществить рекомендацию номер 5? Вы видите, здесь перечислены эти действия. Это расширение расследования контактов в домашних очагах, включая среди детей, людей с устойчивыми формами туберкулеза. Это обновление национальных мер политики, стратегии по профилактическому лечению туберкулеза, приведение их в соответствии с последними рекомендациями ВОЗ. Это расширение инвестиций и построение синергии с организациями, которые занимаются отслеживанием контактов по COVID-19. Это тестирование более активное на наличие туберкулезной инфекции, профилактическое лечение туберкулеза, применение новых лекарственных средств, более коротких схем химиотерапии, а также обеспечение приверженности лечения и поддержки соответствующей. А кроме того, это лечение профилактическое туберкулез людей, живущих с ВИЧ, получающих антиретровирусную терапию. Это мой заключительный слайд. Спасибо за внимание. Если у вас будут вопросы, я буду рада на них ответить. И хочу завершить свою презентацию неким таким девизом, да, что пора действовать для того, чтобы ликвидировать туберкулез. Большое спасибо, Саяхат, за такую интересную, полезную презентацию. Я думаю, что, безусловно, последуют вопросы в конце нашего заседания. Сейчас я хочу передать слово доктору Георгию Кучукидзе, который работает в Европейском региональном бюро ВОЗ, он является эпидемиологом, и он расскажет о ликвидации туберкулеза в Европе. Георгий, слово вам. Доброе утро, добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Слайды видны? И хорошо ли меня слышно? Скажите, пожалуйста. Да, мы вас видим и слышим хорошо. Сайхат и Андрей в предыдущих презентациях уже представили обзор тех обязательств, которые были сделаны для ликвидации туберкулеза, и также уже рассказали несколько слов о глобальном прогрессе по достижению, реализации всех этих обязательств, достижению целевых показателей. Я хочу сконцентрировать ваше внимание именно на работе, проделанной в Европейском регионе ВОЗ по реализации обязательств, принятых на 2021-2030 год. Расскажу о периоде после 2020 года. Как вы все хорошо знаете, 2020 год – это заключительный год, который у нас заложен в действующий региональный план действий. Экран виден, что-то я потерял. Итак, 2020 год – это заключительный год реализации текущего плана действий по борьбе с туберкулезом, который полностью увязан с целями в области устойчивого развития, целей по ликвидации туберкулеза, предусматривает амбициозные целевые показатели для Европейского региона на 25% снижения заболеваемости по сравнению с 2015 годом. И да, у нас 20% это глобальный такой показатель. Если мы посмотрим на то, на каком этапе мы находимся, то мы увидим, что мы достигли снижения на уровне 19% в период с 15 по 19 год. Это говорит о том, что мы можем выйти за глобальный показатель на уровне 20% и будем близки к достижению целевого показателя снижения числа случаев заболевания туберкулезом 25%. Что касается смертности, целевой показатель – это снижение на 35%. В период с 15 по 19 годы мы добились снижения на уровне 31%. Мы идем нужными темпами и практически уже вышли на целевой промежуточный показатель 2020 года. 35% должно быть снижение случаев смерти. как Сайхат и Андрей уже говорили, они уже говорили о совещании ООН высокого уровня и о тех обязательствах, которые были приняты государствами в декларации по итогам этого совещания в 2018 году. Здесь вы видите обязательства, которые касаются профилактики и лечения туберкулеза. Это охват как минимум 30 миллионов человек профилактическим лечением туберкулеза с периода с 18 по 22 год, включая 6 миллионов человек, живущих с ВИЧ, 4 миллиона детей младше 5 лет, которые являются контактными в домашних очагах с больными туберкулезом, и еще 20 миллионов людей в домашних очагах туберкулеза. Это те глобальные обязательства, которые были подписаны главами государств. Учитывая то, что профилактическое лечение является основной темой нашего трехдневного совещания, я хочу рассказать именно о прогрессе, достигнутом в Европейском регионе по реализации принятых в этой области обязательств. Итак, во всем мире 6,3 миллиона человек начали профилактическое лечение в период 18-19 годов. Это 21% от целевого показателя 30 миллионов, который предусмотрен на 5 лет. Из этих 30 миллионов людей, которые должны были получить лечение, 2 миллиона находятся в европейском регионе ВОЗ. И вот из этих 2 миллионов в европейском регионе 191 тысяча человек получили профилактическое лечение в 2018-2019 году. Это всего лишь 10%, что существенно ниже глобального ориентира. Это говорит о том, что мы, наверное, вряд ли сможем достичь данного целевого показателя, мы гораздо ниже средних по миру показателей. Давайте посмотрим более пристально и посмотрим, где же находятся основные пробелы и как можно ускорить прогресс в этой области. Давайте посмотрим на домашние контакты больных с активным туберкулезом в возрасте младше 5 лет. Мы увидим, что региональный прогресс чуть-чуть не соответствует глобальному. Вы видите, сколько детей получили лечение в 2018-2019 году, 21% от общего числа. Мы должны были охватить 200 тысяч детей в период с 18 по 22 год, а в мире это 4 миллиона человек, детей в возрасте младше 5 лет. Что касается контактных лиц, домашних, в очагах старше 5 лет, то видите, глобальный целевой показатель 20 миллионов. Из них 179 тысяч человек получили лечение в 18-19 годах. Это глобальная цифра. И практически 60% зафиксированы именно в европейском регионе ВОЗ. Прогресс в нашем регионе опережает прогресс в мире, да, это 23 против 1%, но этого слишком мало для того, чтобы выйти на полумиллионный целевой показатель, который мы должны охватить за 5 лет, с 18 по 22 год. Данные по проведению профилактического лечения людям, живущим с ВИЧ, у нас проверяется регулярно UNITAIDS, данные проходят валидацию во Всемирной организации здравоохранения, и до 2015 года страны представляют данные по людям, которым был поставлен диагноз, и которые начали АРТ, но начиная с 2016 года страны призывают представлять данные по всем людям, которые получают АРТ. И здесь надо сказать, что в мире достигнут довольно хороший прогресс. 5,3 миллиона человек, живущие с ВИЧ, получили профилактическое лечение туберкулеза в 2018 и 2019 годах, что составляет 88% от целевого показателя в 6 миллионов людей, которые должны были быть охвачены с 18 по 22 год. Но стоит отметить, что 3 страны в мире – это Индия, Танзания и Южная Африка. Вот эти 3 страны, на их долю приходится практически 60% от 5,3 миллиона человек, живущих с ВИЧ, которые получают профилактическое лечение туберкулеза. В Европе показатель гораздо скромнее, только 45 тысяч человек получили лечение в 2018-2019 году. Это 3,3% от целевых 1,35 миллиона человек, которые должны были получить лечение профилактическое. Это все люди, живущие с ВИЧ. Вы видите, что, конечно, в регионе существует целый ряд проблем в этой области. Каковы же эти трудности, каковы же вызовы? Из того, что мы видим, трудности мешают достижению целевых показателей по профилактическому лечению. Это, возможно, проблема учета отчетности показателей по профилактическому лечению людей, живущих с ВИЧ. Только 10 государств-членов предоставляют данные в UNAIDS с использованием глобального инструмента по мониторингу ситуации со СПИДом. Это может быть вопрос именно предоставления учета, ведения учета, предоставления отчетности. Это также может быть проблема непосредственно назначения или проведения профилактического лечения в этой группе пациентов. Мы знаем, что в соответствии с рекомендацией ВОЗ все люди с ВИЧ, не имеющие активной формы туберкулеза, должны получать профилактическое лечение. А еще одна проблема – это охват детей в возрасте младше 5 лет. Он остается непропорционально более низким в некоторых странах Европейского региона, а в других странах мы видим довольно хорошее наращивание масштабов работы с этой возрастной группой. Что касается домашних контактов в возрасте 5 лет и старше, не получают систематического лечения в странах, не входящих в Евросоюз, Европейскую экономическую зону, это Восточная Европа, Центральная Азия. И мы видим такую постоянную довольно динамику включения в программы профилактического лечения этой возрастной группы в странах Евросоюза, Европейской экономической зоны. К сожалению, данные по другим группам риска, которые также у нас входят в текущие рекомендации, не учитываются в глобальной базе данных по туберкулезу. И у нас нет данных, мы ими не располагаем именно по этим дополнительным группам риска. Как я уже сказал, 2020 год является заключительным годом реализации регионального плана действий. Было принято решение продлить действие данного плана до 2030 года, не изменяя существенным образом заложенных в него мероприятий в 3 областях вмешательства. И мы только лишь пересмотрели обязательства на 25 и на 30 год, а также была обновлена программа мониторинга и оценки, заложены целевые показатели на 25 и 30 год. Что касается региональных обязательств на период после 2020 года, здесь вы видите данные на 2025 год, это на 75% снижение смертности от туберкулеза, 50% снижение заболеваемости от туберкулезом и показатель успешности лечения больных МЛО туберкулезом на уровне 80%. Мы видим, что показатели 2015 года используются в качестве вот такого сравнительного исходного критерия. Что касается системы мониторинга и оценки, она была выработана в рамках консультационного процесса, был изначально экспертами разработан такой проект. Эта система мониторинга и оценки еще в августе 2019 года. За этим последовал обширный процесс пересмотра, разработки целой группы индикаторов, также обсужденных в рамках консультаций. Затем это все было доработано в 2020 году, и в итоге мы получаем вот такие 18 показателей по различным областям вмешательства. 10 из этих 28 являются ключевыми показателями для европейского региона ВОЗ. Я хочу подчеркнуть 3 вот таких показателя из этих 10 важных. Они непосредственно связаны с профилактическим лечением туберкулеза. Это показатель включения в профилактическое лечение людей, живущих с ВИЧ. Здесь прописаны и числитель, и знаменатель для стран. Это охват лечением латентной туберкулезной инфекции у детей, контактных в возрасте младше 5 лет, и также охват контактных с мероприятием по скринингу на активную форму туберкулеза. Здесь также прописаны категории лиц, которые подлежат профилактическому лечению. Это все, что можно сказать о прогрессе, достигнутом в нашем регионе. Я хочу лишь несколько слов сказать о ежегодном докладе по мониторингу и отчетности в Европе. ЕЦКЗ публикует его в марте каждого года, и данный доклад включает очень подробный обзор прогресса достигнутого, а также прописывает все показатели, которые включены в систему мониторинга и оценки, и которые мы все считаем очень важными для нашего региона. Это был мой последний слайд. Большое спасибо за внимание. Я жду вопросов и обсуждения. Большое спасибо, уважаемый Георгий, за обновленную информацию по ситуации в регионе. Наш следующий докладчик, доктор Авинаш Канчар, он является врачом по профилактической медицине, социальным вопросам. Он имеет большой опыт, уже на протяжении 17 лет занимается проблемой туберкулеза. Доктор Авинаш работает в команде, которая занимается диагностикой, профилактическим лечением и оказанием помощи в глобальной программе борьбы с туберкулезом, является медицинским специалистом, и как раз он сейчас расскажет о всем том, что необходимо сделать для наращивания масштабов профилактического лечения. Он расскажет нам о модуле по профилактическому лечению туберкулеза. Это модуль 1. Он расскажет о рекомендациях и практическом руководстве. Авинаш, слово вам.
Я надеюсь, что вы видите хорошо мой экран. Так как Оскар уже говорил, я расскажу вам о недавно опубликованных рекомендациях Всемирной организации здравоохранения, но прежде чем я перейду к ним, я бы хотела сказать несколько слов о глобальном докладе по туберкулезу, который был представлен в прошлом месяце. И хочу подчеркнуть, что его можно сейчас найти на мобильной платформе на английском, французском и русском языках на этом приложении. Таким образом, аудитория может скачать этот доклад. И вообще работать с этой платформой очень удобно. Вы можете сканировать данные, сравнивать эти данные. Сейчас мы остановимся на тех руководствах, которые были недавно опубликованы. Несколько слов о дефинициях, которые я буду использовать в своей презентации, которые используются в этом презентации. Ладно, туберкулезная инфекция – это состояние персистирующего иммунного ответа, который стимулируется микобактериями туберкулеза, антигенами микобактерий туберкулеза, без какого-то проявления клинических симптомов активного туберкулеза. Здесь мы сравниваем такое вот дормантное состояние и активный туберкулез. И в своей презентации я не буду сосредотачиваться на этой терминологии. Сейчас мы отойдем от этого определения. Далее существует целый ряд терминов, которые используются в этих документах. Это профилактическое лечение туберкулеза, профилактическое осуществление профилактического лечения. Это тот термин, который мы сейчас все чаще и чаще используем. Когда мы говорим о тесте на туберкулезную инфекцию, мы говорим о кожной туберкулиновой пробе или анализе высвобождения гамма-интерферона игра. Когда мы говорим о домашних контактах, мы, как правило, говорим о людях, которые находятся в одном жилом пространстве с индексным больным в течение одной или нескольких ночей, или в течение более длительного времени на протяжении последних 3 месяцев. Несколько слов хочу сказать о том, как развивались рекомендации ВОЗ в отношении профилактического лечения туберкулеза. Это лечение рекомендовалось уже достаточно давно. В нескольких публикациях за последние десятилетия описывалось профилактическое лечение туберкулеза с рекомендациями. Далее последовали комплексные рекомендации. Но В основном эти рекомендации были разработаны для стран с высоким уровнем дохода, низким уровнем распространения инфекции, и таким образом остальной мир, так сказать, был выпущен из внимания. Недостаточно было разработано четких рекомендаций для территорий с высоким уровнем распространения инфекции. Поэтому в 2018 году мы провели целый ряд тематических обзоров для того, чтобы оценить данные из стран с высоким бременем туберкулеза. Было разработано несколько рекомендаций, которые были подготовлены специально для этих условий. В руководствах 2015 года были пересмотрены рекомендации, разработанные для стран с низким уровнем распространенности. Были проведены как минимум 2 больших клинических испытания, их результаты были опубликованы с разными подходами, с представлением фактических данных по использованию изониазида у беременных и сочетного применения рифапентина с делтагравиром. Были проведены исследования, которые еще будут опубликованы, но мы решили обновить рекомендации в начале этого года и представили эти рекомендации в документе тоже. Теперь в этом документе представлено 18 рекомендаций, которые касаются каскада медицинской помощи, который начинается с выявления лиц в группах риска, далее исключение активного туберкулезного процесса, далее следует текст на туберкулезную инфекцию и предлагаются варианты профилактического лечения туберкулеза. Впервые за это время мы подготовили практическое руководство по профилактическому лечению туберкулеза, которое также соотносится с подобными ВОЗовскими рекомендациями. И если вы посмотрите, что это практическое руководство поддерживает реализацию профилактического лечения туберкулеза, содержит дополнительную информацию о профилактическом лечении, касается улучшения работы по расследованию контактов, мониторинга безопасности и других программных показателей, которые нужно регулярно отслеживать. Кроме того, это практическое руководство собирает фактические данные, сопоставляет эти данные для ответа на часто задаваемые вопросы при программной реализации профилактического лечения туберкулеза. На этом слайде вы видите ссылки на ВОЗовские документы. Представлены рекомендации по выявлению людей в группах риска, начиная с людей, которые живут с ВИЧ, взрослые подростки, независимо от получения РВ, наличия беременности, предыдущего лечения туберкулеза, уровня иммуносупрессии и доступности теста на туберкулезную инфекцию. Младенцы младше 12 месяцев, если они находятся в контакте с больными туберкулезом, и дети в возрасте старше 12 месяцев после исключения активного туберкулеза. Это те группы, которые предназначены для профилактического лечения туберкулеза. Что касается домашних контактов с больным туберкулезом, сюда мы включаем детей до 5 лет, люди в возрасте от 5 лет и старше. Теперь это такая глобальная рекомендация. Теперь мы эту рекомендацию используем и для стран с низкой распространенностью инфекции, а также контакты с больными МЛО-туберкулезом для стран с высоким уровнем распространенности. Несколько слов о фактических данных, которые наша группа рассматривала при разработке рекомендаций. Это систематический обзор, который был проведен в 2018 году. Вы видите, по всем возрастным группам это исследование было проведено, изучалось отношение риска для контактов с больными туберкулезом. Мы видим, что этот риск часто в 20 раз выше, чем среди населения в целом, а иногда и в 25 раз выше. Здесь мы также учитываем статус латентно-туберкулезной инфекции. Если эти данные отсутствуют или тоже нужно подумать о проведении этой работы. Это рекомендации для людей, которые имеют какие-то клинические состояния, люди, которые начинают антифонуотерапию, находятся на диализе или готовятся к пересадке органов или трансплантации. Далее следующая группа – это заключенные, медработники, иммигранты из стран с высоким бременем туберкулеза, люди без определенного места жительства и людей, употребляющих наркотики. Но у нас пока нет рекомендаций относительно систематического тестирования или лечения при диабете, злоупотребления алкоголем, табакокурении и недостатке веса. На этом слайде вы видите сводную информацию по всем целевым группам населения, в которых рекомендовано проводить профилактическое лечение туберкулеза. Следующая рекомендация – это исключение активного туберкулеза. Для всех целевых групп населения скрининг симптомов рекомендуется в целом. Для людей, живущих с ВИЧ, вы знаете, это вот такой симптоматический скрининг на отсутствие кашля, лихорадки, потери веса, ночного потоотделения, для того, чтобы можно было безопасно начать профилактическое лечение туберкулеза. То же самое касается контактов у детей. Это недостаточный вес, лихорадка или кашель и так далее. Если вы посмотрите, у нас есть рекомендации теперь по проведению рентгенографии даже в странах с высоким бременем. Вы видите, здесь эта рекомендация касается людей, живущих с ВИЧ, которые получают антиретровирусную терапию, и контактных лиц. Далее мы говорим об отсутствии клинических признаков и изменений на рентгенографии грудной клетки может быть использоваться для исключения активного туберкулеза перед началом профилактического лечения туберкулеза. Здесь вы видите, что если ЛЖВ получает антиретровирусную терапию, то чувствительность здесь достаточно низкая, предиктивная ценность положительного результата указана здесь. Если отсутствуют симптомы, то можно начать профилактическое лечение туберкулеза. Если мы добавим рентгенографию, то чувствительность повышается. И мы видим, что эта рекомендация сохраняется для ЛЖВ, которые получают антиретровирусную терапию. И невозможность проведения рентгенографии органов грудной клетки не должна являться барьером для начала профилактического лечения. Даже при только скрининге симптомов мы можем получить определенную прогностическую ценность этих результатов. Далее в наших руководствах мы предлагаем такой сводный алгоритм. И здесь я бы хотела выделить только то, что этот алгоритм четко говорит об использовании туберкулезной пробы или игра. Если нет возможности их проводить, то предлагается проводить рентгенографию грудной клетки, или если и это невозможно сделать, то все равно предлагается проводить профилактическое лечение туберкулеза. Когда мы проводили систематическое исследование для сравнения туберкулезной пробы и игра, мы говорим, что можно использовать либо туберкулиновую пробу, либо игры для тестирования туберкулезной инфекции. Когда мы говорим про игры, мы имеем в виду квантиферон и ТБ-голд, которые прошли оценки. Более поздние поколения подлежат оценке и обзору. Как я уже говорил про рентгенографию грудной клетки, тест на туберкулезную инфекцию не является требованием для начала профилактического лечения туберкулеза у людей, живущих с встреч и лиц в возрасте моложе 5 лет, находящихся в контакте с людьми с активным туберкулезом. В возрасте руководства тимиазида и рифампицина.
Все, в целом больше ничего нет. То есть все просто, ничего не намудрили. Хотя я ожидала, честно говоря, я ждала, что
Трехмесячный.
сунут как минимум вентилятор, будет охлаждение, будет какие-то функции, какие-то преломленные LED-лучи. Кстати, о них.
ARH, because the fixed drugs combination which are child friendly are available and are being used in many countries for
в наших, в моих. То есть они вообще отличаются кардинально. Здесь выглядит все по-другому. Я не знаю, надежнее ли, лучше ли это, отличаются ли они, потому что в описании нигде я ничего не нашла. Ни на каких-либо сайтах, ни у брендопроизводителя на сайте. Я не нашла описание подробно этой лампы. Какие у нее преимущества и чем она хороша. То есть были вообще какие-то стандартные названия лампы для маникюра и педикюра подходит. У нее есть съемное дно, у нее есть столько-то лампочек. Кстати, это 54 ватт лампа. Я не увидела здесь снижение мощности, уровень мощности, где снижается. То есть только старт, стоп, все, больше ничего нету. Лампа очень увесистая, очень такая надежно выполнена. Тут какой-то еще сенсор, видимо, такая пластина прозрачная. Я думала, что все вот эти дырочки, это будет обдув. Я прям надеялась, что...
Алло, да.
Валерия,
Да.
пожалуйста, там на кухонном столе стоит компьютер, записывает с нами на конференцию.
Да.
Пожалуйста, не трогай его.
А звук включить тоже надо?
Конечно, все надо.
case should be confirmed.
Я 3
meaning
минуты
the
назад выключила,
MDR-TB is
даже
confirmed
меньше.
bacteriologically and susceptibility to fluoroquinolone is also assessed. And testing is considered important in this population, along with clinical follow-up for up to 2 years, even after the TPT course is completed. So just to brief the group, there are 3 clinical trials that are currently happening in South Africa, Vietnam, and 11 other countries, and by the name TP-CHAMP, VQueen, and Phoenix. The first 2 trials are looking at levofloxacin only compared with placebo, while Phoenix trial is looking at delamanid versus isoniazid. And the timeline, we expect results from the TB-CHAMP next year, and VQueen and Phoenix would be later when the data would be available for WHO to consider recommendation. Moving on to WHO operational handbook that I mentioned, it provides a lot of implementation considerations and evidence to allay anxieties and FAQ, frequently asked questions around TPT scale up by the program colleagues, including starting from strengthening the contact investigation, which was highlighted in previous presentation as one of the weak links in scaling up TPT. So the handbook provides ways and considerations on how to strengthen contact investigation, particularly update of the guidelines, the staff or cadre that would be implementing, and how to build capacity, and needs for additional investments, particularly in the forms of enablers and incentives, as well as to support home visits and travel to and for the health facilities. The handbook also talks about TPT adherence, although there is no conclusive evidence on the best way to monitor adherence. Interventions like pill counting could be useful. Similarly, adherence support is an important element to consider for programs. Identifying appropriate treatment supporter, motivational counseling, and linking the person with peer support networks, using electronic reminders like SMSs. Video observed treatment could be considered where it's feasible and available. For people living with HIV, it's important to integrate TPT into the DSD models of care. And moving on, the handbook also discusses at a great length on monitoring adherence, and it provides some indication on how to define TPT completion. For example, for a 3HP regimen, which is 12 weeks of 3HP, we indicate if 11 doses are consumed within 120 days, it may be deemed TPT, it may be reported as completion. So for different regimens, there is some suggested cutoff to define TPT completion. And further, this is a very small font, but this just wanted to highlight that the operational handbook provides different scenarios when people miss TPT doses, and how do programs or the healthcare workers address those situations. For example, if there is an interruption of less than 2 weeks, TPT could be resumed as soon as the person returns. And if the interruption is more than 2 weeks, and if less than 80% of the doses are taken, in that case, programs may need to consider restarting TPT. So there are several such scenarios presented in the handbook for all the regimens that are now recommended. Similarly, for management of adverse events, it summarizes a lot of evidence on the frequency of adverse events, and also provides some guidance on how best to manage those events, highlighting the need to check the adverse drug reactions at every contact with the person, maybe physical or remote, and the importance of immediate redressal of those adverse events. We encourage use of digital tools like SMSs or video calls for early reporting or prompt action from the healthcare workers, and we also highlight the need to use existing mechanisms to systematically record these adverse events. However, no vertical system is required as we do for MDR-TB programs. For the handbook, as I mentioned, provides some evidence around on concerns that are raised, like use of TPT in pregnancy. So we undertook a systematic review for the 2020 guideline, which also looked at the data from the TB Appraise trial that raised concerns around the use of isoniazid for pregnant women. But the systematic review showed no association of IPT with any adverse pregnancy outcomes. There was no increase in risk of maternal hepatotoxicity, and so there was no need to defer the TPT to postpartum period. So the guideline group also advised pregnancy not to be considered as a disqualification for TPT, and routine LFTs were not indicated unless there are other conditions which mandate LFT, and several TPT options, including the triple pill combination of 6 months INH tremoxazole B6 was suggested in this group. But systematic use of vitamin B6 supplementation was highlighted. Moving on to another concern that was raised in the past on co-administration of rifampicin and dolutegravir, particularly programs which are transitioning to dolutegravir-based ARVs, and a trial report evidence was considered by GDG, the Dolphin trial, and which did not observe any the reduction in DTG levels, which were not significant. And so no dose adjustment was recommended. Some practical questions that are asked usually, how often do we need to repeat or restart TPT? So there is no evidence to date on the utility of repeated courses of TPT. Although WHO recommends the 36 months INH regimen for a very high TB transmission settings, we also know no country actually implements this regimen at present. Uh, we also know of these results from the VIP3 TB trial, which came out in 2019, uh, which compared the use of 3 months INH rifampicin used once or twice compared to 6 months INH. And the treatment, although the treatment completion rate was better with 3HP, the outcomes were very similar with use of once or twice rifampicin regimen. So a repeat course is not recommended even among people living with HIV. A course of TPT could, however, be considered among HIV positive or HIV negative people who received TPT in the past, but they a new exposure or close contact of a TB patient is confirmed. So, in these situations, on case by case basis, repeat course of TPT could be considered. On adverse events and other issues that are usually raised, like risk of drug resistance, the handbook collates some of the evidence and presents for programs to consider. Basically, what we see is the adverse event is seen in very small proportion of people who receive TPT. Most often, they are self-limiting, they are reversible, and the rifamycin-based regimens have a better safety profile. The concern around drug resistance is actually not substantiated by any evidence to date on increased risk due to programmatic use of TPT. And the question on how long TPT will protect. If there are several studies which have looked into this, and the range of protection is between 6 to 19 years in different settings, epidemic settings. Quickly sharing some evidence that around the adverse events I mentioned. There was a large systematic review which looked at 23 RCTs, 55 non-randomized studies, and if you see the statements in green, the withdrawal due to adverse events is seen in very small proportion of patients, even in the clinical trial settings. And the hepatotoxicity risks are very low, particularly in the rifamycin-based regimens. They are close to 1%. Rifampicin resistance. There was a systematic review done in 2016, which looked at 6 clinical trials with a large number of patients who received TPT, and if you see the only 6 in those who received the rifamycin developed drug resistance, and there was actually no difference between those who did receive rifamycin and who did not. Similarly, in the intermittent use of rifamycin, the risk of increased drug resistance is not significant. And similarly, for use of isoniazid, 2006 systematic review, which had reviewed all the data since 1950s, found no increased risk of resistance due to use of isoniazid. So, in the nutshell, there is no evidence which substantiate any concerns around increased drug resistance. For the longevity of protection from TPT, as I mentioned, there are several studies which show different levels of protection starting between 6 to 19 years. And this study, from 1950s in Alaska Natives, was done actually when the rates of TB disease were extremely high, actually more than what we see in Southern Africa now. But still the protection was noted up to 19 years. So there is a long period of protection with the course of TPT, provided the risks of exposure are not very high. So So this is my last slide. Just wanted to highlight the opportunities that the programs have now with the high level political commitments discussed in previous presentations, the revised guidance and the revised operational handbook that we have, availability of shorter TPT regimens. We have a 3 months as well as a 1 month regimen now, and hopefully in near future we'll have other short regimens. And then there are several donor initiatives which are supporting scale up of shorter regimen, including the Global Fund grants that have recently happened. And there is a lot of support coming in from several technical partners. So I'll acknowledge my colleagues from the department, including Dennis Falzon, who is also who will be presenting on one of the sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Avinash, for your great presentation. So, as we were saying before, one of the purposes of and objectives of this meeting is to scale up the new WHO guidelines on TB preventive therapy. So the next speaker is Dr. Cecily Miller. She is the technical officer at the Global TB Program on the Division of TB Prevention, Diagnosis, Treatment, and Care and Innovation. So she will be presenting on the latest developments on strengthening the global policies and screening and intensified active case finding. Thank you very much. Cecily, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And can you see my screen okay? Or should I switch the view?
Everything is fine. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And as mentioned, I'm going to present on systematic screening for TB. I'll be presenting the WHO current guidance and implementation tools and give an overview of the update to the guidelines, which is currently underway. So beginning with the current guidelines. And actually, let's just step back with the brief overview, which I think we all know, but the role of TB screening in TB care overall and why it's important. And I think we all know this in general, but the most recent data emphasizes and underlines that there is still a large case detection gap for global tuberculosis. In 2019, we see 7.1 million people were diagnosed and treated for TB out of an estimated 10 million cases. And we know that the progress still lags in achieving the UN high-level meeting targets, which earlier speakers have already mentioned today. And we also know that the COVID pandemic of this past year is going to negatively impact case detection further, most likely. We can see here one graph from the Global Tuberculosis Report of this year shows the trends in notifications and the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on that. So we envision that there will be some further catching up to do. And also we know that TB screening is an essential first step in identifying people who are eligible for preventive therapy, as Avinash was just mentioning. So the current WHO guidance for systematic screening for TB defines screening as the systematic identification of people with suspected or presumed active TB within a predetermined target group or population using tests, examinations, or other procedures that can be applied rapidly. So it's distinct from clinical evaluation in the healthcare setting, of course. And key features about a TB screening intervention are that it should be done systematically in a predetermined population. It should be done using a highly sensitive initial screening test with the goal of identifying people who have a higher probability of TB, not with the goal of diagnosing, but just identifying a group with a much higher risk of TB. Thus, it should also be followed by a diagnostic evaluation using a test with a high accuracy for diagnosing TB. And it needs to follow certain ethical principles that are specific to screening outside of providing care in the clinical setting. So it has to adhere to some higher ethical standards as well. And the objectives of screening are twofold. So on the one hand, we are trying to identify and help people at an individual level. So we're trying to identify people who have undiagnosed TB prevalent in the community and perhaps don't have access to adequate or timely care for diagnosis and treatment. And we're trying to bridge that gap. And we're also trying to identify people who could benefit from preventive therapy. So we can rule out TB and begin that. We're trying to, within these patients, improve treatment outcomes and reduce costs associated with seeking a diagnosis for TB or receiving treatment and care. And you can see down here on the bottom, this is perhaps a bit small to see, but this is just laying out what we call the patient-initiated pathway to receiving care for diagnosis, beginning with when a patient's exposed, perhaps becomes infected, develops disease, recognizes their symptoms, seeks care in the healthcare setting, eventually gets referred for evaluation, and then receives diagnosis and treatment. And of course, we all know that there are many places in this pathway where things can get delayed or missed. And the screening pathway here presents several opportunities where some of these steps can be skipped over so we can speed this process along. But screening also has a second objective, of course, at the community level to reduce the overall burden of TB, increasing detection of prevalent TB currently in the community, thus eventually reducing the prevalence and averting future incidents of the disease and reducing transmission. However, to date, the evidence basis that screening can in fact achieve all of these objectives is rather weak. So because of this, we really need to proceed with caution when implementing screening interventions. Nevertheless, screening is an important part of the NTB strategy. We see that it's an integral part of the Pillar 1, providing early diagnosis and thus systematic screening in certain groups that are at high risk or we know have a very high burden of TB, including household contacts and other close contacts. And so global policy was issued in 2013 from WHO, providing some key principles and recommendations for conducting screening and illustrating a range of possible screening algorithms that could be used. Here is an example of one such algorithm, showing a screening algorithm that begins with symptom screening, goes on to chest x-ray as a secondary screen, and then finishes with, this is GeneXpert here, as the final diagnostic test. So in addition to recommendations, there are 10 such algorithms like this that are laid out in the 2013 guidelines that are provided as options for screening. So I'll now go through the recommendations from screening from the 2013 guidelines, and this essentially identified several populations for which screening was either strongly recommended or conditionally recommended. And the first three recommendations are the strong recommendations, and these are groups that we've already been discussing today for the most part. Number one, household contacts and other close contacts should be systematically screened for TB. We know, of course, that they have a very high burden of active TB. The prevalence is often between 3 and 5% in this population. And we also know that they're an essential group for scaling up preventive therapy. Number two, people living with HIV should be systematically screened for active TB at each visit to the health facility. And these, in fact, these first two recommendations were already established and in WHO guidance before this meeting. These guidelines were released, as we know. And number three, the strong recommendation was that current and former workers in workplaces with silica exposure, which is most commonly minors, should be systematically screened for active TB. And this is due to the high prevalence of silicosis in this group and the associated lung disease and risk for TB and poor outcomes with TB in this group. There are then a series of conditional recommendations from the 2013 guidelines. The first is that systematic screening should be considered for prisons and other penitentiary institutions. This includes both prisoners and people who work in the prisons, as the exposure is quite high in these places for all people involved. And we saw, of course, in Avinash's presentation that this is also a group that's at high priority for preventive therapy. Number 5 and 6 show a couple clinical risk factors that are highlighted for screening. And so this would be screening that typically takes place in the clinical setting. Number 5 is that systematic screening should be considered for people with an untreated fibrotic lesion seen on chest x-ray. And this is because this can quite often progress to active disease. Number 6 is that in settings where the TB prevalence is 100 per 100,000 or higher, systematic screening should be considered among people who are seeking healthcare and who have a risk factor for TB, who belong to a certain risk group. And these are many of the groups that Avinash highlighted previously, many groups that have increased risk for TB. And this can also be specific to the context or setting in which it's being conducted, based on the prevalence of TB disease and other lung conditions in that population. And then last are 2 conditional recommendations for screening or active case finding interventions to be conducted in the community or in the general population. The first is that screening could be considered in the general population in defined areas with extremely high levels of undetected TB. The threshold was set at 1% prevalence or higher, which we now know does apply in some settings. And that part B of this recommendation is that screening for active TB may be considered for other subpopulations that have very poor access to healthcare, such as those living in urban poor settings or urban slums, homeless people, people living in remote areas with poor access to healthcare, or other important vulnerable or marginalized groups. And this can include some tribal or indigenous populations, some populations of migrants or refugees or internally displaced persons as well. So these are 2 groups in which screening being conducted in the community may be considered. There's also some implementation guidance and tools that went along with the WHO guidelines that are already existing. So these included operational guide that was released in 2015, as well as the Screen TB tool, which is an online tool to help countries implement and prioritize and do program planning for TB screening efforts. So first, briefly discuss what's laid out in the operational guide. And this essentially presents a planning and implementation cycle for implementing systematic screening at the country level. And the idea with this is really to ensure that screening is conducted in a systematic and planned out way, such that the highest risk groups are prioritized using the most effective screening algorithms, and also that screening is not done at the cost of other important TB interventions, because we know that screening is a resource-intensive intervention. While it can have high yield, it's often very resource-intensive, and so there needs to be a thorough analysis to make sure that opportunity costs are appropriate for implementing screening. So the process that's laid out here is actually presented as a cycle, and I'll describe a little bit why, but begins with a thorough situation assessment to understand what the epidemiology of TB is in a local setting, what the distribution of risk groups with the highest risk for TB are. It then goes on to defining the objectives of screening. So which groups are the highest priority? What is the main objective? To find more cases or to begin preventive therapy, etc. So from these 2 first steps, we can go to the prioritization of risk groups for screening efforts. And again, we saw earlier there are several risk groups in which TB screening might be conducted. There are some for which it should always be conducted, if at all possible. And then there are others for which there needs to be a careful determination of when and where and if it should be conducted. For those groups that are chosen for screening efforts, next there needs to be a choosing of screening tools and algorithms to be used in each group, and then establishing the necessary budget and implementation plan, and then followed by careful monitoring and assessment and evaluation of the screening program. And this is to ensure that if the program is not having the intended effects or is having consequences that were not intended originally, there needs to be a reassessment and modification of the screening plan at the national level or the subnational level. So along with this guidance, there's an implementation tool. It's called the Screen TB tool. You can see here where it can be found on the web. And this is a tool designed to help assist countries to do some calculations to model the potential yields and costs and cost effectiveness in terms of cost per case detected for a variety of potential screening approaches. And this is to allow countries to generate some budget estimates and also to prioritize among risk groups to be screened, and then to help decide which screening algorithms might be used for each of those risk groups. It compiles data from a number of different sources, including some WHO and other global data repositories, as well as systematic reviews that inform the WHO guidelines, other published literature, and there's an essential portion of data that the user must provide as well, specific to their context and setting and TB epidemic. The tool then uses these inputs to produce estimates of the yield of screening across a number of potential hypothetical screening programs that are modeled, the total costs of the screening, and then the cost per case detected. And it allows for these estimates to be compared across different risk groups and across screening algorithms within a risk group. So this is what the interface looks like. I'll briefly just show, I don't expect for you to see any of these numbers, but that the tool produces a number of outputs, but as you can see, it's quite hard to make heads or tails of this. This shows each of these colored sections represents one risk group. For instance, here is general population. The second one is household contacts. The third one is people living with HIV. And within these, each line represents a different possible screening algorithm to be used. And this shows the estimate of the number of true positives, false positives, true negatives, false negatives, the possible numbers of missed cases, costs, and cost per case detected. But again, it's quite hard to take in all of these numbers. So the tool also produces a series of figures to help users rapidly assess some of the outputs. So for instance, here the tool will show estimates of the yield of screening in any given risk group. Each graph represents one risk group, with each bar representing a different potential screening algorithm that can be used in that risk group. And we see here in blue the estimated number of true positive cases, and in pink the estimated yield of false positive cases. And this is to highlight the risk that a screening algorithm with low specificity could present when screening in a population with rather low prevalence. And we see the combination in some of these populations. For instance, in the first bar, looking at screening in the general population, with the algorithm in the middle, which has rather low specificity, we can see the risk of finding a large number of false positive cases when screening in this population. So this is to help give a sense of what algorithms would be a better choice in these populations. And we also see some graphs comparing the cost per case detected. In these graphs, each line represents a different risk group or population for screening, and each of the points on the bottom on the x-axis represent a different screening algorithm. And we see that the cost per case detected increases, of course, with algorithms that use more expensive but more accurate tools. And then along with this, we have graphs of the number needed to screen, again, in each population and across the different algorithms. And we see that that goes down with more sensitive algorithms. So I also just want to mention that there's a mobile app called the Prevent TB app, which can be used for certain screening interventions. And you'll hear more about this later. Dennis Falzone will be discussing this later. And this is primarily for TB preventive therapy, but it also can be used with screening interventions in certain populations. And it's actually a really wonderful tool to use for gathering data when implementing those interventions. So for instance, it works very well with contact investigation. It can be used to gather the data while the intervention is being implemented, and to monitor through the cascade of care, through identifying people to be screened, doing the clinical assessment, referring those who are symptomatic for diagnostic evaluation, and then testing and providing preventive therapy for those in whom active disease is ruled out. So this is also another great tool. So lastly, I'll give an overview of the update to the TB screening guidelines, which is currently underway. So the goals of this were to consolidate and update all of the current recommendations for screening to bring them in line with the most recent evidence, as there have been some really important trial data as well as further prevalence survey data in the last 8 or 9 years that shed some new light on how screening should be considered in the whole cascade of TB care interventions. There's also a need to evaluate and look thoroughly at some new screening tools and technologies that have become available in the last several years to evaluate their potential use for TB screening. We want to provide some more specific guidance on the use of screening tools and algorithms for specific screening populations, and to update and expand the implementation guidance that goes along with these. So to begin this process, in the fall and winter of last year, we conducted a scoping questionnaire and user survey with guideline users to understand the level at which the current guidelines have been implemented or adopted or adapted, and to understand the needs and the desires of guideline users. We had about 118 respondents, most of them from national TB programs, and we got some guidance that the new guidelines should be short, simple, and clear, provide guidance on these new tools and technologies, and give more specific guidance on screening approaches, frequency, and integration of screening approaches. Excuse me, my apologies. So our guideline process update is being guided by several questions. The first batch of questions have to do with the effectiveness of screening. Excuse me. For benefiting individuals and communities. So we're asking, does TB screening prove effective at identifying cases at earlier stages of disease and improving treatment outcomes? Does it result in lower costs to individuals identified through screening? Are there any social or other adverse consequences of screening? Does TB screening affect subsequent health-seeking behavior? And then also, how does it affect community epidemiology in terms of the number of cases detected, case notification, and then subsequent prevalence? So just to show a logic model of how we're thinking that TB screening operates in the community setting, to illustrate how we came up with those lists of review questions for the guideline update. And then to go along with this, once it's been established from that data whether and if TB screening should be conducted, we have a series of questions on how TB screening can be done, looking at what's the performance of existing tools, including symptom screening and chest radiography. We're also looking at new tools such as the use of computer automated detection softwares or CAD softwares for reading of chest radiography in the screening and in the triage context. So we're looking at that in this guideline. We're also looking at the potential role of WHO-approved rapid diagnostic tests, where we're calling MWRDs. This includes expert as well as other similar automated nucleic tests that are in the same category, and their potential role as screening tests as well as diagnostic tests in the area that we're familiar with them with. We're also looking specifically among people living with HIV at the performance of some novel screening tools. So they're the ones that we've described above, as well as some other possible tests, including C-reactive protein, for which there's been quite a bit of research in the past several years. So we're looking at if it might be a potential screening tool. And then we're also looking specifically at children under the age of 15. What's the accuracy of a range of different screening approaches in this group? There's also some background questions that are informing the guideline update as well, mostly to inform implementation questions and guidance of interventions at a high level. So the first one is, what is the number needed to screen in order to detect one case of active TB in a group? And here we can just be reminded that the number needed to screen is a very rough estimate for what the burden is in a group and essentially what the magnitude of effort is required to detect these cases. We also have a question about what are the costs and cost effectiveness of screening across a number of different populations, and what is the acceptability of screening to communities and individuals who are being screened. And I lastly just want to let you know that at the union conference, which was held last week, I believe, or maybe the week before, we had a symposium where 5 of the systematic reviewers who were informing this guideline update presented the results of their reviews. So if you're interested in seeing what some of their findings were, you can follow this link. I believe it should be available on YouTube for at least a while longer. So just to give a timeline for the guideline update process for completing it, we have now held all of the guideline meetings, which were held between June and October of this year, following the scoping and the commissioning of the systematic reviews. We're currently consolidating the recommendations and working with the steering committee and the guideline development group to finalize the wording and the overall organization of the guidelines. The final draft will be under review by the external review group later in November and early December, and then we'll submit the final document to the guideline review committee in December of this year. And assuming that it's approved and everything goes according to plan, we hope to release this document along with updated operational and implementation guidance and tools for World TB Day next year, 2021. So stay tuned for that. With that, I'll thank you and open to any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cicely, for your great presentation and update of the upcoming release of the module 2 on TB screening and active case finding. So right now, dear Chair Alberto.
Yes, Oscar, please.
Yours. Thank you.
I think we have we can devote. We are a bit late on the program. We can devote 12 minutes for the questions. There are some questions pending on the chat, and I try to guess who is the best person to provide an answer. These, I think, is for Cecily. Nelly Solomoni asked how frequently the screening of active TB and LTBI should be provided for different risk groups.
Thank you. That depends on the group, and it's often a matter of feasibility, as we do not have a lot of specific data on when screening should be conducted. So for risk groups such as household contacts, usually the emphasis is to conduct the screening and find the contacts as soon as possible after the initial exposure. If there's possibility for repeated screening, there is evidence that shows that within the first year, repeated screening can also have additional yield. But really, it seems to me like in implementation, reaching contacts at least once is the highest priority. For people living with HIV, again, this varies quite a bit in terms of whether they're regularly on ART care or not. If they're initiating in care, there's emphasis to do the screening as they're first getting enrolled in ART care. If not, the screening is said to be conducted at every visit to the health facility. In the updated guidelines, we're looking more closely at with the possibility of using other tools beyond just symptom screening. What's the best frequency and sort of plan of care for implementing those different tools? So we'll be providing some more guidance on that. And with other groups, it's really sort of specific to each group in terms of the level of exposure, the access with the person in the health facility. And again, it's often guided by feasibility and opportunity, not so much by data. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. There is another question for you. And this is from Pierpaolo De Colombani. I'm very grateful to hear from you, Pierpaolo. Nobody has forgotten about you. I guess, in Copenhagen. And he asked, what about TB screening in refugees?
Yes, this is a group that is identified as a important risk group for screening. When we mentioned the conditional recommendations for screening in populations, vulnerable populations that perhaps have limited access to care, this group is identified within that recommendation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Then there was another question from Nelly Solomonia, but both Avinash and Andrei have already answered to her on the chat. And we have a question from Grigory Volchenkov, and I think that probably Avinash is in the best position to answer to this. Please share comparative analysis of IGRA test versus TST with reference to sensitivity and specificity for LTBI and predictive value for active TB.
Yeah, thanks for the question, but unfortunately I don't have the numbers at hand. But what I can say is the systematic review that compared the two tests, the relative risks overlap. So there is basically no difference between these two tests for identifying the latent TB infection. So I'm not sure if Alberto, you would have those numbers at the top of your mind. But I would request you to refer to the latest guidance, and in the discussion we do mention some of these data.
Yeah, well, what I can just comment in addition is that the most important of those parameters is the positive predictive value, and the positive predictive value is very low for both tests, and it's about 2 for both. Sorry, Cecily, please.
Yeah, I would just wanted to add that just to remind that they're not recommended as screening tests for active TB. So the screening to rule out active TB needs to be conducted first.
Thank you very much. Then we have here another question, and probably this again to Avinash, and it is from Tariel Gorgoliani. What about screening of medical staff working in TB facilities for tuberculosis infection?
You're muted.
Avinash, you need to unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, I was looking for the button. So the question is not clear. So is the question if healthcare workers should be prioritized for TPT? If that is so, yes, it's one of the recommended populations. Is that the question? Am I getting it right? So,
yes, that was the question. Then
Alberto, there was a question from one of the Russian-speaking colleagues, Tatiana Stoicheva. Would you please ask your question and unmute your microphone? Thank you. Татьяна Стоичева, вы можете задать свой вопрос?
Татьяна, можно на русском, мы переведем.
На русском, да. Если нет, то тогда я озвучу этот ваш вопрос. Было сказано, что не обязательно обследовать на туберкулезную инфекцию перед назначением профилактического лечения контактной. А если не проводить тест на туберкулезную инфекцию, можно пропустить активный туберкулез бессимптомный. Или не могли бы вы уточнить? Скорее всего, этот вопрос также адресован Авинашу.
Yeah, for contacts, as I showed the evidence that was considered by the guideline groups, the relative risk is 25 times more than the general population. So the immediate household contacts, the risk is very high. But as Cecily also mentioned, it's important to rule out active TB, and you could do it with the symptom screening, and if there is any symptom or any doubt, then a sensitive test for TB should be used. An X-ray could be used. So we have to be really very sure that active TB is ruled out before TPT is considered in any population.
Thank you, Avinash.
Then there was another question, and I could address it. There are two components, so I addressed the first part to Georgi and the second to Avinash. Nino Lontadze asked which program between TB and HIV programs is intended to report about the indicators on tuberculosis infection treatment and enrollment rate. And the second question to Avinash is, hence, which program is recommended to implement preventive therapy among people living with HIV?
Maybe I'll start with the first part of the question. So thank you, Nino, for the question. As we do at the moment, as I mentioned during my presentation, the TPT among people living with HIV is collected through the Global AIDS Monitoring. So this is the tool used by UNAIDS, and usually the data is reported by AIDS programs, HIV AIDS programs. And there is a suggestion that this should be checked later on, that in some countries the TPT is provided by TB programs, and there might be a miscoordination between the TB programs and HIV/AIDS programs, and that's why I mentioned the possible issue of having data recording and reporting issue, not the actual issue of enrollment of people living with HIV on TPT. But this should be investigated more closely, and we'll do this during the next few months. Thanks.
For the second part, Alberto, I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was which program should take responsibility for preventive therapy in people living with HIV?
Yeah, so this is one of the very common questions we have been facing for forever. But since the HIV program, the PL-HIV are in care for the HIV programs, we suggest the HIV programs take the responsibility.
Thank you, Avinash. There is a very last question, is a clarification from Dariel again, that actually he points out the fact that when doctors have completed the preventive therapy course, they go back to work and they're exposed again. So what can you do for that?
So if I may say, and others could also add, but what we suggest is an annual screening for doctors and healthcare workers who have high risks of exposure. But for a course of TPT, what we say is at least one course of TPT should be given to all healthcare workers and doctors, obviously based on the screening and testing. And usually the protection is long lasting, but if a fresh exposure and a long-term exposure is confirmed, a repeat course could be considered.
Thank you very much, Avinash. Now it's 1 o'clock. I think we are at the end of this first session. Unfortunately, there is no time for me to recapitulate a little bit what has been said during the morning. However, it was a very interesting session to open this workshop, and the discussion has also been very active. You have seen the message that you can write more questions you might have, and the speakers will then answer to those. We break for is it
10 minutes?
Just a second. So I've received some messages in private to controversial messages to limit and not to limit, and therefore let's do a democratic voting and see what we do, either to limit our break, which we kind of earn it, or to maintain it for the 30 minutes as initially planned, which actually makes a bit of delaying the start of the session, of the second session. So I've got 27% of the participants voting. We'll wait a bit more. Let's move on. 32 out of 93. 40%, please vote, vote, vote. Уважаемые коллеги, выразите, пожалуйста, хотите ли вы ограничить перемену на 15 минут или все-таки оставить 30, как изначально было запланировано?
I think that most of the participants already responded that we can limit our break for 15 minutes. And we can reconvene at 1:15 the Central European time in exactly 15 minutes from now. And we will start with the second session. Would you please do not disconnect, and we will continue. Apologies for the speakers from the second session, and thank you for joining. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Leah. Leah D'Ambrosio, this is Andrei. I need to find out and identify which of the Leah is GB. And could you unmute yourself and speak up? GB, could you unmute yourself and speak up? I need to identify the hosting, the co-hosting role. GB, could you unmute yourself and identify yourself? GB Migliori. Salman, this is Andrei. Salman, this is Andrei. Would you advise me whether you would like to present or I should run your recording from my side? Over to you, Salman. Salman, could you please unmute yourself and advise me?
Hi, Andre. How are you? Sorry, I was downstairs getting coffee.
Oh, okay. Look,
I'm here.
I'm so happy you've managed to connect. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
So I've got everything from from you on my side. I've got your recording, everything. So
Perfect.
would you advise me to run from my side, or you want to?
Yeah, run it from your side only because in case there's transmission problems, sometimes my internet goes in and out.
That's
so
okay.
Everyone will have it, and then I'll be here to answer questions for sure.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Nice to see you, as always.
GB, this is Andrei. GB Migliori, this is Andrei. Could you please identify which account you are using to participate in the workshop? I have 3 accounts of Leah, and I don't know which one you're going to use. Over. Leah, could you unmute yourself and advise me what account GB is going to use? Over to you. Okay.
Sorry, Andrei. Alberto speaking.
Alberto?
So if it is all right for you, I could introduce the first speaker of the afternoon, and then I would need to go. or do you want me?
This is absolutely fine. Everything has been arranged. Oscar is going to take over and act on your behalf, and I'm going to support him as a co-chair. That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrei.
Thank you, Alberto, for everything.
No, thanks, Oscar. Very interesting morning session.
Indeed. Greetings to all men which wear mustaches. November is the Movember movement.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's mustache month. How are you, Oscar?
I'm good. Thank you, Salman. Good to see you. Thank you
Nice
for joining.
To see you too.
Yeah.
It's a good month to grow a mustache, I think.
Yes. And that's the only month when I wear them. Otherwise, I will shave them out because it's itching and I have some complaints in the house.
Yeah, it's definitely itchy.
Dear Alberto, I think we can start the second session. So do you want to take the lead or you want me to go ahead?
As you like, but I can even go, and then, as said, after the first speaker, I will have to leave, and I leave you the chair.
Sure.
It's fine?
Thank
Is that fine?
Yes, please. Please go ahead. Yes.
Perfect.
So we start.
Perfect. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm afraid that this was a short break, but we have a little bit tight program also for the afternoon. We are going to start session 2, which is on TB elimination, which focus on tuberculosis infection. And we have 3 very interesting presentations this afternoon. The first one, and I'm very happy to introduce, is given by Xenia Rosales Klintz. She works in Stockholm at the European Center for Disease Control, and she will report on the ECDC scientific advice on programmatic management of LTBI and how this is taken from the countries in the region. Xenia, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, and I can see also your slide.
Perfect, wonderful. I apologize that I will not be able to show my video because my internet connection is not of sufficient quality, but I hope you can follow these slides, and if any problems arise, please shout, literally. So thank you very much for this kind invitation to present today. Let's see if I can move the slides. Now, so the purpose of this presentation is threefold. Basically, I would like to give you an overview of what ECDC has been working on the latest years in relation to programmatic management of tuberculosis infection. I will also like to briefly present what are the upcoming activities we are planning in this area. And if time permits, to explore a bit what is the take from member states in their experiences in the implementation of programmatic management of tuberculosis infection. So at ECDC, we have different areas from which we tackle the common ground of programmatic management of tuberculosis infection. The more prominent one is scientific advice, where we produce, when needed, systematic reviews or technical reports, interactive tools, and then we gather all this evidence in guidance documents. Those I will briefly present today. But we also have other ways of supporting EU member states to reach this common goal. One of them is the Country Support Project, which is an iterative activity that comprises trainings, exchange visits, and consultancies that are more tailored to specific countries Today I will just give you some examples of what type of activities in particular in relation to programmatic management of tuberculosis infection have been put in place. We can also conduct jointly with the WHO Europe country visits where we support member states by the review and assessment of their activities implemented. And by doing that, we can focus particularly on this aspect that we are discussing today. Another way we used to support our member states is by facilitating interactions. And this is initiated by a particular country that is interested in knowing, for example, how other colleagues are dealing with screening or registries for tuberculosis infection. And then we just try to put people together. And this is more informal way of helping, but still valid. And this is as simple as sending an email with a query. And that's how we start. So, for the scientific advice outputs, I want to say upfront that I will not go much into details of the content, partly because today I think is more linked to the most recent guidelines launched by WHO, but also because I have included all the links to the documents in this presentation. So once you have these slides, you can go to your pace into those documents that are more relevant to you or your country. So just to give you a sense of time on how the ECDC document relates to other ones. We started, as some of the other speakers have already mentioned, on the same departing point when the action plan for the region was set up, and also once the elimination framework for low incidence countries was set up. Our document was published in 2018, but in fact it started its process more or less at the same time as the 2015 guidelines from WHO. So the other remark I want to make is that ECDC took the emphasis of low incidence countries because those are predominant in the EU-EEA region. So that's also to take into account. Just briefly to say that as you have already or has already been mentioned by other presenters today, this is a long process in which many elements of evidence have been taken into account. For the ECD guidelines in particular, it started with the assessment workshop already in 2013, and from that point onwards, several pieces of evidence collection were performed, from systematic reviews, mathematical modeling, and then expert panel discussions before coming with the final product. So it's also just a sense of the time investment for this type of activities. Just to highlight one of the outputs from that effort that is not so frequently mentioned is this very simple, if we compare with the previous one that has been presented in the previous session, this calculator that used 4 EU countries as models to estimate costs in relation to different type of screenings in a specific population. This is a resource that is publicly available, and it was developed as an Excel file with some simple instructions to give notions to TV programs on how they could go about estimating costs. And as I mentioned before, you will find the slides, the link in these slides. So the aim of the guidance document from ECDC published in 2019 was to support EU member states in the decision-making process underlying the implementation of the programmatic management of tuberculosis infection. And I also have to say that we always aim to be complementary to to the activities that WHO has launched, both in headquarters and for the European region. So it should not be perceived as a contradictory, rather complementary. I will not go into detail, as I mentioned, but just to highlight that some of the aspects that have been we have been talking today are still valid in terms of the risk groups, in terms of diagnostics algorithm. Of course, the most recent updates are in relation to treatment, and those are not reflected in this document from 2018. But we do talk about options for implementation strategies to, for example, increase adherence to treatment, but also how to tackle or how to reach health providers so that they can also support populations at risk in a better way, as well as how to initiate program monitoring and evaluation, hopefully by establishing a case-based registry of TB contacts, and that will also facilitate the implementation of more systematic activities. I also want to highlight that at ECDC we have introduced some elements of programmatic approach in different type of outputs, not only those that are specific for tuberculosis. Here in this slide you can see a series of documents that were more specific for prison settings, where tuberculosis and tuberculosis infection screening were part of the diseases highlighted. And this is also part of the holistic approach of how to tackle in vulnerable populations. Similarly, there is a guidance also published in 2018 on how to go about screening and vaccination for infectious diseases in newly arrived migrants, where tuberculosis and tuberculosis infection are also mentioned. And this relates to previous comment on how to deal with refugees. So I hope that this resource could be of use for some of you. Now, I would like to move to country support activities because my personal take on this particular topic is that as important as the scientific evidence, exchange of experiences play a very important role on how we operationalize things. So the country support project has been running from 2016, perhaps even earlier, 2015 to 2018, the first iteration, and from 2019 to 2022, if I'm correct, the second iteration. This is a more open mechanism that is more reactive to the needs of member states. Here I'm just showing you they are more closely related to the topic of today. For example, in 2016, there was an exchange visit to Finland where participants from highly prioritized countries in the European Union were invited to see how Finland worked TB contact investigation. Then in 2017, a consultancy or two consultancies were provided to Latvia, and this is more a tailored approach to the specific needs of this particular country, derived from their own needs assessments. And basically what they requested was support to how to go about the diagnosis and preventive treatment of TB infection among people living with HIV, and also how to start thinking with regards of the surveillance registry for tuberculosis infections for contacts. So that was very targeted for that particular country. There are also trainings that can be set up. In 2016, hosted in Estonia, there was one specific training on latent tuberculosis infection, as we used to refer to them. And more recently, in 2020, we were able to, thanks to the collaborations with RIBM, to implement one face-to-face workshop in Greece before the pandemic hit hard in the whole Europe on active case finding that also has a component on the screening of TB infection. I know that there has been another activity conducted online, and here I will encourage Gerard, if you're with us, to comment further in the chat box about that experience. But just to highlight how different fora may allow countries to exchange and learn from each other. Another type of activity that I mentioned in the beginning is a country visit, and I know that Gerard will expand about the Dutch experience tomorrow. But I just want to take the opportunity to say that last year a joint mission from WHO, Europe, and ECDC visited the Netherlands with an overall goal of how to ascertain how to improve, if possible, the TV services provided in the country. One of the specific objectives related particularly on the screening and prioritization of TB infection among migrants and as a specific group. And I think I personally was very thankful to have this first-hand experience of what it implies for a country to be in the forefront of these tasks. Again, there is a report that you can download from our webpage with more detailed information of what we observed at that point in time. And I'm sure that Gerard will tell us more tomorrow. Now, we had planned for 2020 a new project, or at least to initiate a new project with the purpose of generating LTBI prevalence estimates, and if possible, estimates on progression to active disease, with particular focus on at-risk populations. This is our way to help member states to make this problem possible for decision makers. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been forced to postpone this project to 2021. So at this stage, it's still in the planning, final planning stages, and I hope to be able to tell you more about this next year. But if you already have questions, please use the chat box to place your ideas, comments, or suggestions. Now, with the permission of the chairs, and this is an idea that came to me, I would like to ask all participants to use the chat box in the coming minutes, if not in the whole session that pretty much relates to these two questions. I want to ask your opinion and experiences, particularly if you are a country that is already implementing, if not fully but partly, programmatic management of tuberculosis infection. I would like you to share with us what is the most important lesson learned so far that you would like to tell other European countries. And if you are a country that has not yet started implementation, please do ask what do you want to know from other European countries that are already working on that, fully or partly. Because to me personally, I think for the purpose of this workshop, those are the seeds for a very fruitful discussion. So this is all from my end. I was not planning to have a long presentation anyways, but I'm more than willing to answer your questions if any. Thank you very much.
Dear Xenia, thank you very much for your great presentation. And ECDC is a very instrumental partner for the WHO Regional Office for Europe, and we're working on the many aspects on the on tuberculosis, especially on surveillance and response monitoring. We jointly publish and release the tuberculosis surveillance report every year, and we also a part of the TB network that is being held by the ECDC. So, Senia, thank you very much for adding 2 questions to the end of your presentation. It would be wonderful if we will share with all the participants these questions and we will collect the answers without asking participants to answer to them right now, if you don't mind. Senia?
Sorry, I was muting. Of course, I will post the questions in the chat.
Oh.
And then I will follow up accordingly. Thank you.
Yes. So we will also, we can also share these these questions by email with all the participants, so they can respond, and then you will be copied to that email as well. So it is my pleasure to announce the next speaker, Professor Salman Keshavji of the Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Who is also the director of Harvard Center for Global Health Delivery and chair of the Zero TB Initiative Steering Committee. Dr. Salman Keshavji is also a senior TB advisor at the Boston-based non-governmental organization called Partners in Health, and he will be talking about the lessons learned in delivery of TB preventive activities in the framework of the Zero TB Initiative. Dr. Keshavji, the floor is yours. Would you please unmute your microphone and share your screen? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Oscar. I think you guys are sharing my screen for me because I wanted to make sure there was no transmission issues.
That's absolutely correct. I'm going to run just in a second.
Hi, Good morning. My name is Salman Keshavji, and I want to thank our host from the WHO European Regional Office for inviting me to participate in today's workshop. Today I'm going to talk about TB preventive therapy and why it's such a critical component of the comprehensive approach for TB elimination. You all know well the current global TB situation. The situation is worrisome because the rates of decline are very slow, and at this rate we will not meet our global goals. For example, drug-sensitive TB declined 1.3% per year between 2006 and 2016. A little bit better in the Euro region, of course. MDR TB declined only 2.1% per year globally between 2006 and 2016, and XDR TB increased by 7.9% per annum between 2006 and 2016. And in fact, it was more in the Euro region. So can we reduce rates of TB faster? Well, the answer is yes. The elimination phase can be achieved using the epidemic control strategies that have existed since the early 1960s. So the first part of the strategy, as you know, is to search for people with TB. When Konrad Röntgen invented the X-ray in 1895, it really changed the game. It provided a sensitive tool to identify people with pulmonary TB. The first group to operationalize the use of the X-ray was that of Sir Robert Phillips in Edinburgh, Scotland. They realized that in order to find patients with TB, you had to look in the community. And not only would you find the patient, but you would find their family members and other people who might be infected with the bug. The use of mobile X-rays, so a highly sensitive diagnostic, became the backbone of the active case-finding strategy used in most Western countries. In a study in 1934 in New York City, out of 25,000 close contacts screened for TB, a rate of more than 3,000 per 100,000 people of active TB was discovered. And similar findings were seen all over Europe and the United States in the 1930s, the 1940s, and 1950s. And not only did this contribute to finding more cases, but if cases were found early, there was also decreased mortality. The second piece of the comprehensive strategy to stop TB was treating TB disease correctly. Because because I want to use most of the time today talking about TB preventive treatment, let me just say, as far as treatment of active disease, early treatment with the correct medicines in a multi-drug regimen stops transmission of both drug-resistant and drug-sensitive strains rapidly. And this is the foundation of the approach that the Zero TB strategy uses today. The third part of the comprehensive approach to stopping tuberculosis was to prevent TB infection from becoming active disease. Treating TB infection, so infection that has not yet progressed to clinically apparent disease, is an essential part of stopping transmission. This key component of the strategy to stop TB and move us towards elimination was discovered in Alaska in the 1950s and 1960s. At that time, Alaska had some of the highest rates of TB in the United States, with a prevalence of 2,000 per 100,000 population and an incidence of around 500 per 100,000. 1 in 4 infants in some areas became infected in the first year of life. The annual mortality from TB was 282 per 100,000. So in the 1950s, the United States Public Health Service started an ambulatory treatment program to treat active cases. They soon found that even when they had screened households and communities using X-ray, they still saw new cases of TB emerge. And so they realized that there must be some sort of dormant phase. And in 1957, they began a randomized control trial to evaluate the use of isoniazid prophylaxis. So after community-wide TB screening and treatment, people without disease were randomized to receive isoniazid or placebo. The rates of TB in the intervention group were less than half of the control group who did not receive the prophylaxis. There was a 68% risk reduction that was attributable to the INH prophylaxis. And when Comstock followed people over the next 20 years, he saw that they had a reduced risk of TB over that period. Most importantly, what Comstock and his group showed was that if you did active case finding, treatment of all forms of disease, and treatment of TB infection, you could bring down community-based transmission of the disease. And the way they did this is they looked at children who were between ages 1 and 3 years because they realized they could only get TB from their family and their near community members. And in 1950, 1 in 4 children were getting infected with TB. After the implementation of active case finding, treatment of all forms of disease, and treatment of TB infection, that dropped to 0. And with that combined approach, the incidence rates of tuberculosis in Bethel, Alaska, and Alaska in general, when this was implemented more widely, dropped rapidly and markedly. We have the basic principles of TB epidemic control. Search actively for newly infected people among the close contacts of current patients using a sensitive test like X-ray. And of course, if these people live in a high-burden community, you may want to widen that to the whole community. Start therapy quickly for people with disease. Give them the safest, most effective for their strain of TB, most effective multi-drug therapy that can be given in the shortest amount of time. Ensure adherence to therapy with supports, and treat all contacts that do not yet have disease with post-exposure prophylaxis. And of course, ensure proper infection control. And this approach can help us move towards the elimination phase of tuberculosis. The example in Alaska was just the first of many examples. Another example was New York City in the late 1980s when they had an outbreak of tuberculosis. By the late 1980s, the number of TB cases in New York City had tripled over the previous 15 years. In central Harlem, the case rates were over 200 per 100,000, exceeding many poor settings in the world at the time. Nearly 1 in 5 patients in New York City that had TB had MDR-TB. And the proportion of MDR-TB had more than doubled in the previous 7 years. And so you saw that really there was community-based transmission. In order to stop the epidemic, New York turned to the tried and tested approach of active case finding, treatment of all forms of TB, and treatment of TB infection. And with that, they were able to drive down their rates of TB rapidly and markedly. Same thing in Russia in the 2000s. Many of you will recall the 1990s when Russia's MDR epidemic started. At that time, of course, there was the economic breakdown, very high rates of incarceration, detention, alcohol use, and unemployment. And because of lack of funding, they had to discontinue some of the effective components of Soviet-era community-based TB control, including X-ray screening and preventive therapy. And all of this was in the face of a fast-growing HIV epidemic. In places like the civilian sector in Tomsk, in Western Siberia, TB rates were very high. But over time, with Global Fund funding and funding from a lot of partners, whose names you see here, the rates of TB started to drop, and in fact dropped more than 50%. Now, the program there included active case finding, treatment of all forms of TB, and treatment of TB infection in drug-susceptible patients. The same approach was used in another province in Russia, Voronezh, where in partnership with the Voronezh TB services, TB rates dropped from 69, now close to 10, again, with the same combination of active case finding, treatment of all forms of TB, and treatment of TB infection in drug-susceptible cases. Most recently, we've seen similar drops in Karachi, Pakistan. Karachi is an Asian megacity, and when you think about it, this was a very tough project, but the group from Indus Hospital and IRD, with funding from the Global Fund and working with various levels of government in Pakistan, rolled out fleets of X-rays, just like those that were used in the West in the early 20th century. This time, of course, they used digital X-rays, they were read using artificial intelligence, and people who had X-ray abnormalities gave samples that were then tested using GeneXpert. And their findings were startling. In the areas where the interventions weren't done, you kind of see a flat line, what we see in many countries with TB, where the rates just stay the same. In the findings in the places where there was active case finding, treatment of all forms of TB, and of course, in the latter part of this project, treatment of TB infection, you start to see that TB rates, after the surge, you start to see a drop. And when they've measured the drop in the area where they implement the most intense search, treat, and prevent strategy, they've seen an almost 25 to 30% drop in rates of TB. And this, again, in Asian men. So what do all these programs have in common? Well, it's interesting. What do all these projects have in common? Well, they are comprehensive, so they all include the search, so searching using a sensitive test, and they include treatment of all forms of disease with the proper supports, and they include prevent, so prevention of exposure, but also treatment of exposure with TB preventive treatment. So they're comprehensive, and they're also simultaneous. People aren't just doing one part, the treatment but not the prevention, or the treatment but not the search. In order to break the cycle of disease and transmission, you have to do all three at the same time. And this is the basis of the Zero TB Initiative, which is a comprehensive strategy for TB elimination. A group of different partners came together, and the Secretariat sits in an NGO called Advanced Access and Delivery. And this is an alliance of cities and districts and countries that have come together to eliminate TB. Elimination. Now, this was captured in The Lancet in a series on how to eliminate tuberculosis in 2015. There's a lot of materials that show, take the data that came out in The Lancet and put it into the search, treat, and prevent circle, which we call the search, treat, and prevent chakra. The goal of the initiative is to support local coalitions to create islands of elimination. These islands of elimination would use the search, treat, and prevent strategy, the comprehensive approach, and by implementing them would find out what is required in order to expand this to the rest of the region or country in which they're located. A number of partners have been involved in this work, and we're all very grateful for that. And now there are Zero TB projects in a number of different countries around the world. So why is TB preventive therapy so important to achieving Zero TB? Well, it's a critical component for turning off the tap. So if you look at the 7 million people that we find every year that have TB, a certain percentage are smear microscopy positive. A number of them are smear microscopy negative and require an X-ray, and some have TB, of course, have extrapulmonary TB. Now, if you start to look at this group, you realize that that does not represent the group that has been infected with TB. In fact, that group is much bigger. And that group is of interest because 8 to 10% of them will convert to active disease within the first 2 years after exposure to the index case. So 8 to 10% of a lot of people. And how big is that group? Well, if there's about 10 million TB cases a year, and let's say 2 to 3 contacts will get infected, that's about 20 to 30 million contacts a year, close contacts, should receive treatment. So it's not an earth-shattering number, but it's a much bigger number than the number that we've been dealing with. And that's the number we have to reach because that's the group that we don't know about. They're in the community, their TB turns on, and they transmit often before they get disease that's apparent and come to a doctor. When you think about who needs to be targeted for protection using preventive treatment, it's people who are recently infected, so close contacts of TB patients, perhaps healthcare workers or people living or working in communities with a lot of active TB. It's also people who are at high risk of TB, people with HIV, diabetes, those with low BMI, smokers, people with substance use disorders. TB contacts have a very high risk of progression to disease and dying. I don't have time to go through the numbers now, but I've thrown some sample numbers there. If you have TB disease, your chance of dying from drug susceptible disease is roughly 10%. It's much higher from MDR TB and much higher from XDR TB. Since 8 to 10% of people of contacts will progress to active disease, when they progress to active disease, they're subject to those same risks. So when you think of it, if you are a contact of a TB patient and your TB infection turns into active disease, you actually have a 1 in 100 chance of dying from regular TB, a 3 in 40 chance of dying from MDR TB, and an almost 1 in 10 chance of dying from XDR TB. So treating people with TB infection so that they don't progress to disease is actually life-saving. Including Comstock's work in the 1950s, there have been 23 randomized controlled trials that have shown the effectiveness of preventive therapy and a protective effect of more than 60% in the people that have received it. In many settings, people fear using isoniazid prophylaxis or other prophylaxis because of the risk of developing drug-resistant TB. But in 13 studies that included 18,000 isoniazid recipients, there was no significant increase in the risk of developing drug-resistant TB because you would screen patients properly before you actually start them on therapy. So why is treating so-called latent tuberculosis such a critical component of the strategy for TB elimination? Well, in the past, we had a very incorrect characterization of TB infection. We said that it was asymptomatic, it wasn't contagious, and then you would have active disease, which was symptomatic and mostly contagious. But instead, we now have a more nuanced view of the spectrum between being infected and having disease. And there's a lot of reason to believe that people have kind of smoldering disease where they release some mycobacteria. And this has been shown in the model of granuloma evolution, that there are people called percolators who release some bugs, some people who have mildly active smoldering disease, and then those that have more active disease. And so treatment has to really deal with all of this. Right now, we're using preventive therapy for one side of the spectrum and full treatment on the other, but maybe over time, we'll have to be thinking about this entire spectrum. And although we tend to focus on TB disease for drug-sensitive contacts, multi-drug resistant TB contacts are also subject to disease. In a meta-analysis of 25 studies, 7.8% of household contacts of MDR patients developed TB, most within 3 years of exposure, and 47.2% of contacts had TB infection. Another reason for treating TB infection is that recent work by Sarah Fortune and others has showed that untreated TB infection may contribute to the burden of drug resistance because studies of MTB lesions in macaques, so macaques that had active, latent, or reactivated TB, found using whole genome sequencing that there was a similar number of chromosomal mutations during latency as during active disease, despite reduced bacterial replication during latent infection. So in fact, untreated latent disease may actually be a reservoir for the development of drug resistance. So what should TB prevention look like in the Euro region? Depending on the dynamics of your epidemic, initially when you do active case finding, you sometimes see a surge, and then with active case finding, treatment of all forms of TB plus treatment of TB infection, you see rates of TB dropping fairly rapidly and then eventually plateauing at a much lower level. It is, of course, obvious that a comprehensive approach will require more funding. But currently we spend money on TB control and it's a pretty level spending, and yet we don't see huge changes in rates of TB. With an initial investment in a comprehensive approach, the idea is that it will drive down rates and will drive down costs over a 10-year period. Now, I just want to end with a couple of thoughts. As we're thinking about TB preventive therapy, some of the groups that are really at the forefront of this, like the group doing zero TB and the search, treat, prevent approach in Pakistan, they have actually given TB preventive therapy for individuals exposed to drug-resistant TB, a fluoroquinolone-containing preventive regimen. And out of 800 household contacts, they determined that 215 were eligible for infection treatment, 172 agreed to be initiated, and 121 completed. And there was no TB disease or significant adverse events observed during the 12 months of follow-up in that group. And what's interesting, in another paper that's just being published now, they showed that a fluoroquinolone-based treatment for DRTB infection appears to reduce progression to TB disease by 65%. Again, very similar to what Comstock showed. You're going to hear a little more about this tomorrow, but Vladimir in the Russian Federation is the first place in the world, I believe, to offer comprehensive treatment for TB infection for contacts. Drug-sensitive TB contacts receive 3-HB, MDR contacts get moxifloxacin, and XDR TB contacts, after a thorough screening, receive bedaquiline. And the results are very promising, and you'll hear about this tomorrow. In summary, the lessons that we've learned is that TB preventive treatment is an essential component of the comprehensive approach for TB elimination because it turns off the tap and lowers transmission of TB in families and communities. It's highly protective of individuals vulnerable to progression from TB infection to disease, and we need to provide preventive treatment for all forms of TB, including contacts of MDR and XDR TB patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keshavji, for your presentation. And I think that you will stay with us for the panel discussion, which will be after the following presentation by Professor Giovanni Battista Migliori, who will present the results of the Regional TB Infection Policies and Practices Survey in the countries of the WHO European region and consideration to the regional guidance on TB elimination with focus for programmatic management of tuberculosis preventive treatment. Thank you very much. GB, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we do.
Very good. Thank you. So, abracadabra, it worked. Very good. So, thank you very much for this. The idea here is to present briefly, so I'll probably be able to get a couple of minutes, the result of this survey that we made in the European region, and which was centered about these questions. The availability of guidelines on LTB management. I apologize, this was still called LTBI at the moment we made it, so we know that now WHO has changed the name of the ex-latent, but sometimes it's still written like this. Which groups are tested, which tests are used, what regimens, what about policy to treat contacts of MDR-TB patients. I think what Salman said it's very important, and I really think it's great. Do really clinicians treat contacts in the countries? Are adverse events of treatment monitored? Sorry for the typo. Are the countries equipped with registers for infection, for TPT at the national and or at the local level? And are countries investigating, evaluating the TB infection cascade, and which are the main constraints, right? So this is the map of countries which answered. Unfortunately, COVID caused quite many problems that are much bigger than that of answering questionnaire. But as a matter of fact, we had 14 countries. Sorry, I need to try to move a bit the images here because they are covering my screen. Sorry, otherwise I can. Okay, good. Basically, all countries answered to have guidelines on TB infections management, although some countries had some specific issues. For example, either they had guidelines covering specific aspects like children or contacts or migrants or people living with HIV/AIDS. Italy has issues related to the regional organization of the country, which implies regional guidelines. And in some instances, also the guidelines developed by scientific societies are also considered important or are functional to this. In the vast majority of countries, the guidelines are updated to the latest WHO ones, and all respondents declare to be familiar with the guidelines. Now, which groups, which populations are in fact tested? And we see the number of countries here. Basically, 12 countries are testing HIV, 9 countries are testing contacts, 7 countries are testing severe immunocompromised, silicosis, 10 countries the anti-TNF alpha recipients, the patients on dialysis, 9, same for transplantation. And for the others, there are other groups which, let's say, which are summarized here. For example, Azerbaijan is testing diabetes. It's interesting. For example, some countries this are found interesting, like Slovakia is testing personnel or staff which are returning from staying from missions in developing countries. And which tests are used for screening? Probably that slide is not reporting very new facts. There was also previous CDC survey, another one I'll mention in a few minutes. And it's clear, while a single country is apparently using IGRA only, which is Sweden, the others are using MAN2 and or different combinations, as mentioned here. So a situation which is rather different from a country to another. We tried then to summarize the answer that was given in terms of regimen used, and it was not so we tried to develop a map and putting the figures there. Let's say in all countries, basically we have a mixture of traditional isoniazid containing regimens with shorter regimen, either with 2 drugs or with rifampicin alone. And some of them are using HP, 3HP, which is great. And we see Sweden responded that in that panel. And we have a couple of others who made it. So we had, let me see, Georgia, right? And I think Latvia is planning from 2021 to use 3HP. And this is the situation of the other countries. I think is the first time, according to previous surveys, that countries are moving the European region towards the 3HP. Here we see which countries have a policy for TPT in MDR-TB contexts, exactly following what Salman was just presenting before. Here on the left, the countries, once yes, there were also several notes, so we have reported some, for example, Germany, which is following a quite individualized approach for that. And among those who said no, however, there are countries like Tajikistan, who is planning this shortly, and Ireland, who is in reality doing in household contacts of symptomatic cases. And the counter question, or say the counter check with that second question, where the clinicians treat contacts of MDR-TB patients, we see there is a group of countries who is not treating, and there are 9 of them which are treating sometimes, and just Kazakhstan answered to make this systematically. The other question which is important, as we have conducted a couple of studies, and one published last year in the AJ on the management of the adverse events of new drugs, the famous ADSM, which really raised in further importance of this even in the region, is to see by which extent adverse events of infection treatment are monitored. And while some countries are not monitoring during TPT, others are monitoring based on symptom screening or making blood examination, or being a bit more extensive and making both examination before and periodically during treatment, as we see in the bars. This was a crucial question since, let's say, the former surveys we did in the European region to see by which extent countries are available or are able to implement registers. And there are 3 countries which answered they have a register, but among those who do not have yet a register, with one asterisk, we see some of them are planning it shortly, and some others are updating them, updating the forms soon. So are in the process to be able to capture the information. Is notification of TB infection done compulsory? And 3 countries reported that, and we see that in Azerbaijan and Macedonia answered that they have national local register for TPT, while among those 11 countries which answered they were not, answered that the notification was not compulsory. However, some of them had local registers for TPT, and this local register imply that this information is basically available at least at the peripheral level, maybe not comprehensively, not immediately accessible from the national level, but still a resource for further investigation or for scale up. In terms of evaluation of a TB infection cascade, which is, I think, a very important and complete, comprehensive way to report what's going on. Basically, 3 countries were able to do that, and 2 of them provided some figures, while other countries are still on the way probably to organize themselves in order to do this. The countries which are evaluating the infection cascade indicated as core indicators the screening coverage by population for which screening is recommended, and as fully rational, the treatment initiation rate and the treatment completion rate. And we see here, especially for Andrei Dadu, the data from Moldova, where we see that the completion rate here reported in the questionnaire is pretty high, at the level of almost 80%, while the data provided by Ukraine also provide a completion rate which is at the level of 85%, which is also brilliant. So those are encouraging signs that these things can be done, but of course that they need we need still some effort to implement all this. Here we had a small problem because we asked which were the three main constraints for implementing the what WHO is recommending in terms of strategy, so what we have discussed this morning. And then I think you are more rapid than me in reading what is written there. We asked to organize in order of constraints, so priority, constraint, priority 1, 2, and 3. And the different countries provided very different answers, right? So in some cases, it's an issue of reaching vulnerable groups. In other is issues to organize the register or to organize the compulsory notification. Germany and other countries raised the issue of cost, the cost of IGRA, but also sometimes the cost of implementing some of these interventions. And here again, answer from different countries, which can easily read. Some of these answers, those were really answers very based really on reaction done with the heart, right? And in some of these countries, we reported that LTBI is not a priority, etc. And of course, we are in a low incidence, low prevalence setting, and the priority of TB is going down. That's so the more eventually the epidemiology became favorable, and the more the priority of TB goes down in the research or political agenda. And of course, it's more difficult to keep that priority high in the political agenda. Again, issues here on the cost of some of the drugs or of the 3HP regimen, which might hamper their use, and other issues which are, for example, the difficulty to organize a computerized register, which are real issues which are important at the programmatic level. I suppose more or less you have been able to read what was written there. If I read this, it becomes extremely boring. The second part of the presentation is a brief introduction on this document that I think it's almost published, but I don't think it's published yet. Then the chairs will confirm. It's a document that we have done. I want to thank all the people who work on that. Tuberculosis elimination in the European region, review of key action with a special focus on the management of tuberculosis infection. And I want first of all to start from a snapshot of the structure, so the summary, if you want, of the document. So the document starts with the usual introduction, scope, purpose, target audience, background, aim, methods, and definitions. Okay, that's done. Then there is an EPI session on an epidemiological situation in the European region. We have the story of the development of the global and European frameworks to control and eliminate tuberculosis, the consolidated plans for TB, for MDR-TB in the region, and the ECDC documents 2010, very important. The action framework for OTB incidence countries from WHO, which derived from that famous meeting in Rome, etc., that we organized in 2014 with the European Respiratory Society. Their role played by the Moscow Declaration, the United UN level meeting 2018. We were, of course, unable to include the very last UN event because it was too fresh and this was already finished, right? And then we reported the results of the two surveys, one that was done in 2013 from ERS, WHO, and CDC, and that first author was Leah D'Ambrosio, was published in European Respiratory Journal, and the fresh 2019 eDetect survey, which was really a brilliant thing, and Dominic Zenner and other colleagues who are there work on that, Knut, etc., were part of this effort. And then there is in a document a very clear Gerard de Vries, of course, etc. There is the discussion of the 8 priority actions there, action by action. So action 1, political commitment, action 2, vulnerable, hard to reach groups, action 3, migrants and cross-border issues, action 4, I should put in bold because the most important is the management of TB infection, and then MDR, severe monitor evaluation, case-based data management, invest into research, and action 8, which is the global collaboration, if you want, the global collaboration. Then, it's not going on, just a second. Voila. I conclude with 2 slides, which are a little bit difficult to summarize the conclusions because there are 2 pages in the document. And the conclusions say, of course, TB eradication is not possible without new tools, and in particular, an effective vaccine. TB elimination is epidemiologically plausible, but at the current rate, we might need several decades. And then we focus on the importance of the available documents, available surveys, the importance of going on to push the political agenda, to focus on reducing TB transmission, the special discussion on the indicators we need, and we want to underline one more, the importance of the ECDC proposed indicator of TB in children as indirect measure of transmission, the importance of improving surveillance and region-wide collaboration, which emerge also from some of these constraints reported by countries, and then the role of the guidance and guidelines from WHO and the CDC, and the key importance of the experience gained in different European countries. And the document has made, till the moment we finish it, an effort to make a extensive review of all the literature and reporting all the experience. So there are fantastic ones in the Netherlands, in the UK, in several different European countries, and those are reported by area, by action, just to see, okay, this is what is possible, and let's try to aim to do that. Of course, we need to improve the research efforts. Research is not only that we do in laboratories, and it's not that only on new vaccines, diagnostics, and drugs, but it's also the operational research, which means how we better use the tools we have, how we implement what we have, and how we try to ensure that some of the simple interventions are really applied, and then the importance of developing strong national strategic plans, which include this component and which are funded, so budgeted plans. With that, I have finished, hoping to have contributed to the discussion and showing that sometimes reality has more than one face. Thank you very much. I hope it was a bit shorter, right?
Thank you very much, GB. It was just quite in time. And thank you. With this presentation, we are finishing the second session on TB elimination with the focus on tuberculosis infection. We had 3 speakers. We would like to have them to stay tuned with us during the panel discussion, and which will take for the next 15-20 minutes. So we have some of the questions to the panelists. So and I would like to ask my great colleague Andrei Dadu to highlight some of the questions which were raised in the chat window. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I join you for the thanks to the presenters, and would encourage the audience to raise the hand if your question has not been typed in the chat box or the chat wall. Meanwhile, I will start with the comment from Sayahat, which is directed to GB in regards to the develop a bit more in terms of the methodology of the survey that has been taking on, I think, last year, and you've highlighted indeed that the guidance is under the publication pipeline here at Hero, but would you please be so kind and develop it more in terms of the methodology of the survey. Over to you, GB. Unmute.
I answered with a fantastic typo to the question, right, in the chat.
Okay.
So we sent to all corresponding staff from the countries according to the WHO list, and all countries were invited. But unfortunately, this happened around January, and when it was the moment to answer, it was exactly when there was the explosion of COVID. So it was around February and early March. So we are really indebted with the countries which answered, although, of course, several countries were hampered for the possibility. We understand when there is this, so energies are devoted to the emergency. Simply during the November, December last year, we made a small, let's say, pre-test with a few countries. The answer was included, of course, and then we extended to all countries. So the answer is we invited all, but just those 14 at the end provided an answer. But there is still possibility to do it eventually, and then eventually we can go on and complete the analysis. As the data are there, I might have some interest over.
Thank you very much. There was another comment, I believe, addressed to Xenia that came from Gerard de Vrie. Unless you wish to unmute yourself and make the comment, otherwise I'll be happy to read it for you.
Well, I can unmute myself. You can hear me?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay, so there was a question about this country support project for TB elimination in Europe. And so we conducted a second workshop on active TB case finding in migrants and also in latent TB infection screening in migrants, which was just done a couple of weeks ago. And I think a third workshop is coming up for Eastern European countries in the European Union.
Thank you very much. We could consider this as a complementation of the presentation made by Xenia, and thank you, Gerard, for your comment. There was another comment came from Jean-Paul. Jean-Paul, feel free to unmute. Otherwise, I'll be happy to read it up for you.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to know, we are reviewing our the manager of LTBI. One question is how we survey LTBI, how we record the data, and how we see the progress that is made on detecting and treating cases. And we are thinking on reviewing our system here in France. And I would like to know, in France we have a compulsory notification system for LTBIs in children. And I would like to know if this is done also in other countries. We are not, I think, very happy on that, and we are thinking maybe on changing. This is not. This is a matter of reflection today, and so that is why I think experiences in other countries would be useful for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That is quite an important question regarding the accountability of the cascade coverage. Indeed, and it has been discussed quite agile since the Seoul meeting back in 2016, where Gerard presented the experience from Netherlands. So perhaps this question on whether and what are the experience in the countries of the region regarding the mandatory or compulsory notification of TB infection, either on a certain of the categories of populations, either risk groups or vulnerables. First, let's go through the presenters, through the panel, and explore their vision on these quite important questions. And then after that, the participants are welcome to raise the hand and share with their experience in the countries where they come from. Over. Who would like to start? We have Xenia, GB, and Salman. What is your attitude and the recommendations in regards to the compulsory notification of LTBI? Over to you.
If I can start. So to be provocative, I would say that I like what Salman said, and you know that any time. Okay, I was a believer of the TB elimination strategy, so that's why I put my face in organizing with the 2014 meeting in Rome, etc. And someone in ERS was not very happy because it costed quite a fortune, as you can imagine. And I thought that whenever we discuss about, let's say, management of TB infection, okay, ex-latent, etc., we have to put it in the focus of TB elimination. So anytime that I'm asked to speak about this, I say that. So this document originally had to be about TB infection. I said, let's do it about elimination and TB infection, the core activity 4, right? And anytime that Dennis sent me any, WHO guidelines, etc., I said, look, why in the introduction you don't say that this intervention is the most important to reach TB elimination, right? That is a little bit, I'm joking a bit as usual, right? But I think that whatever we can do to implement registers and make this compulsory and having information on, that famous cascade, which is the completion rate, we really can measure where we stop making individual intervention. So we treat a single individual who has this 70, 80%, whatever protection, and where we start having a community effect, which hopefully will be TB elimination if we can do it consistently, right? So I hope to raise some discussion.
Yeah, can I pick up from what GB just said? I think that this is a key point. Over the last 25 years, we've moved from treating TB as a social disease to more individual, right? So we would focus on the patient, we'd make sure the patient get care, some screening of the family. And I think that when you start to look at TB infection, you start to say we have to kind of really build up. If you're thinking of it in terms of databases or reporting, you have to build up kind of these relational databases, right? That you've got person X, but there's all these contacts. And I'm just thinking of data that I'd seen in Thailand right before COVID broke out. We were talking about contact tracing. And when they looked at TB patients in this one area, Nakhon Si Thammarat, in the south of the country, when they looked at the contacts of TB patients, they found a rate of 1,500 per 100,000. That's the household contacts. When they looked at close contacts of TB patients, so the people who people went to bars with, drinking with, hanging out with, the rates were 6,000 per 100,000. And so you start to think, wow, how would you report this? So I know I'm not answering the reporting question and the compulsory reporting part, but I am saying that what you need to do, I think, to do this right, is to actually build some sort of relational database between the index case, the person that you know as TB, and this kind of community around them that has been exposed.
Thank you very much indeed. Senia, any comments from your side?
Senia just texted that her internet dropped down. She has difficulty connecting. So apologies.
I can also compliment these two wonderful gentlemen over here and say that indeed the accountability of moving into the pre-elimination and the elimination stage is quite an important instrument for the society to advocate more and to make pressures on decision makers at the country level. Therefore, indeed, an information system has to be established on whether this will be the case-based or the aggregated one, whether this will coverage all of the contacts and all of the categories being identified for the eligibility, for being eligible into the cascade for the screening and preventive treatment. This is quite an important question, and we are looking into regulating and providing more evidences to our member states So we just finished the first 5 years of the implementation of the TB action plan, the regional action plan, and we're moving on based on the presentation made by Georgi in the first session into the second 5th-year stage, defining the milestones, where a specific list of indicators that will be included in the accountability framework will be kind of established as well. So this will be perhaps a separate stream that will compile the efforts of the experts in the region to come up with the specific recommendations in terms of the information system being provided and offered to the member states. And that remains an open question, and we will definitely come back to this during the next year, and perhaps we'll have a comprehensive recommendation later on. Are there any countries from the region that would like to speak on this subject? It's about the TB notification. Thank you. Then I see also a comment that came from Russian Federation. Alexei, would you like to speak up? Unless otherwise, I think it's related to a comment rather than a question. Right, so feel free, and we have also the simultaneous translation, don't worry.
Андрей, спасибо большое. Просто, в дополнение к выступающим хотелось поделиться вот опытом Российской Федерации. Может, чат не совсем читает или пропустил. У нас для скрининга туберкулезной инфекции предусмотрено у детей, в частности, два таких глобальных подхода. Первое – это проба с МАНТУ, туберкулинский тест для детей до 7 лет. Почему до 7 лет? Потому что в 7 лет у нас в стране еще пока предусмотрена ревакцинация для неинфицированных детей. Поэтому мы эту пока пробу оставляем. Для чего? Для того, чтобы выявить именно факт инфицирования ребенка. Вот. И вторая проба с детским тестом – это аллерген туберкулезный рекомбинантный, как его еще называют наши зарубежные коллеги, тест ИГРА in vivo, то есть это внутрикожное введение. Он у нас с 8 до 18 лет применяется тоже как скрининговый метод. То есть всем детям, за исключением каких-то противопоказаний, возможно, мы это проводим. И хотелось бы, вот это не услышал, может быть, в следующих наших обсуждениях это будет озвучено. Все-таки инфицирование микобактерий туберкулеза, на мой взгляд, это не совсем латентная туберкулезная инфекция, потому что инфицированных много, а латентная туберкулезная инфекция – это, на мой взгляд, следующий шаг уже развития инфекции туберкулезной, такой уже шаг к заболеванию. И именно, конечно, латентная туберкулезная инфекция является показанием, ее диагностика является показанием для глубокого обследования. В нашей стране также, подчеркну, применяется компьютерная томография у лиц, у которых положительные ИГРА-тесты, не только ИН-ВИО, но и ИН-ВИТРО, квантифероновый тест и СПОТ-ТБ. Вот. И таким детям мы назначаем в обязательном порядке компьютерную томографию уже, для того, чтобы не пропустить малые формы. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое за комментарий. Oscar, back to you. I think this was the last comment that I see on the chat. And yeah, we could move on. Oh, there was
one comment from Gerard, but he will be covering it tomorrow. And I would like, on behalf of our team, to thank all the speakers of the second session, and Ksenia Rosales-Klintz, Salman Keshavji, and GB Migliori, for your wonderful presentations and participation. We also would like to thank everyone for joining today's session. We had a very high attendance with a maximum, I think, Andrei, please correct me if I'm wrong, 114 people, but also there were people joined in groups also through the single access. Tomorrow we will reconvene at 11:30 a.m. Of the Central European time, which is 30 minutes later than we started the day today. So tomorrow will be again 2 sessions, one in the morning, the second one in the afternoon. Session 3 will be is very interesting, and it will be dedicated to the pharmaceutical and supply management to ensure program TB preventive treatment. The session 4 will be focused on programmatic management of TB preventive treatment for vulnerable and at-risk group population. So thank you very much, and please join us tomorrow. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send it to EuroTB email account. We will be happy to forward them to the speakers or answer them ourselves. Thank you.
One more additional question, Oscar. I'm sorry, I was supposed to do it in front of that. All of the presentations are available now on the link that has been shared with you earlier. You can find this either on our webpage, on the set distribution set repository, day one, or if necessary, you can of course indeed ask through the email. Number 2, if you missed any of the presentations or the session, then please feel free to go and search on the Facebook for me, and everything is recorded there for a later browsing and surfing through those 2 sessions today. I will join, and I'm happy to join Oscar and the colleagues here from Euro, and thanking you all. And we'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It was so fantastic to see you all.
Yes, quite an audience from Boston to Vladivostok.
Absolutely.
Wow,
so cool.
We've got 178 registrants. The highest presence was indeed about 114 today. People was jumping in and out. So, and we've initially thought that we'll have up to 50 people, not more. And yeah, it's a good. Thank you very much. You did it, the content providers.
Andrei,
Bye.
take care.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye. Hey, Andrei, you can still hear me?
Yes, very well.
So can you send me a short bio of the 3 presenters for tomorrow morning?
Say it again?
A short bio of the 3 presenters tomorrow morning. I'm chairing the session.
Yes, indeed. Do you have access to the database which I've shared? I mean, the Excel file.
I have to take a look. I was busy.
The link. So in your calendar, you will see basically the invitation for tomorrow, and next to your name, which is the name of the chair, you will see a link to the kind of a table. I have to check whether they've managed to put the bio there. Otherwise, I will do it on their behalf, and we'll basically put.
I just need 2 lines to introduce the speakers.
Sure. Okay. Yes.
And I will. What will be best? I don't know what we did today. Is it better to introduce them simultaneously at the beginning, or no? I think I can better introduce them after.
It's one by one, I believe.
One by one, yeah.
The practice today showed to be
Yeah. Okay. And was there anything else? So, and there was a poll. I haven't looked at it, but Sarah will have this poll, and then we will discuss it at the plenary.
No, I did not got the questions for the pool. We've initially thought to have 3 pools for the first session, Sarah's session, I mean your session, and the session of the modeling and implementation. I've got only the pool for the first session, which I did not manage to set up, which I will do it just before the closure. So we will have about 10 questions to all of the participants to taste the knowledge about the content that has been shared and provided during those 3 days as an knowledge evaluation kind of test. We'll give them about 10 minutes for that, and then during 10 minutes we will after that we will revert back to the audience with presenting and interpreting results, and we'll move into the closure section, the recapitulation, the closure, which will be done by Alberto. And so for the tomorrow, no, I think
Okay.
No pool. That was an offer, a possibility, but yeah.
No, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Interested to see what Unit 8 and also the Global Drug Facility can contribute. I don't know their response, so we will just see.
I've got only the presentation from Sarah from Europe, and she will also she will add a bit of the results of the investigations that we've managed to find out to boost up the discussions. But Pils, please feel free to introduce the session, the subject of the session as well, since you know the background and the reason why this session has been included specifically in the program.
And have you shared that one already from Sarah with me or not yet?
I'm going to do it right away.
Then I know a little bit on how long she's going to speak and what topics she's dealing with.
This is well noticed, and I will do that. Sure.
And I still have to prepare my 10 minutes presentation.
From other two, then I'll be happy to share.
And I will also send my presentation to you, the 10 minutes for the afternoon.
That will be excellent indeed.
Yeah. Okay, I still have to make it, so I'm going to work on it.
Okay, well, we will translate them later on and for the Russian audience. No stress, absolutely fine. We don't have deadlines here. No.
Yeah. Okay, see you tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Коллеги, большое спасибо всем, что вы сегодня с нами были. Завтра продолжим нашу дискотеку, и мы придем с 2 дополнительными сессиями, касающиеся фармакоменеджмента. И вторая – это лучшие практики, которые относятся к скринингу и превенции туберкулеза в определенных группах риска, либо vulnerables. Я обещаю, вам будет очень-очень интересно. Всего доброго, до свидания.